thank you everyone for coming in. We're gonna start doing occasionally, not every Tuesday, but occasionally these little special events where we're gonna have these presentations, mostly focusing on geopolitics and history, but who knows what else might pop in. This will be the first official such Rising Tide Foundation weekday evening presentation. And Martin Sieff, who's a fellow traveler, a wonderful creative soul who's got a lifelong bounty of experience, has agreed to do two presentations, not just one, showcasing a lot of the work and then a lot more newer research that was presented in a series of articles that were last published about a year and a half ago on the Strategic Culture Foundation, featuring some original research that blew my mind, that dealt with the unfolding of certain events at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century that should have gone one way and didn't. And we often think that history, we're often taught at least, that history is something that just happens. It's a series of events in the past. And as I think everybody here who has been to these Rising Tide Foundation lectures has come to realize, we approach history very differently. History is much more competently approached from the standpoint of what didn't happen, what intervened artificially to derail the organic creative flow of a momentum in one positive direction, or at other times, what intervened to stop a dark age or a collapse or atrocity or tragedy from happening for the good. So there are conspiracies both for good and for bad. But if you were to just simply follow the modern standard theory of historiography, you would not be privy to any of that. So Martin is somebody who has devoted his life to the cause of seeking discoveries and sharing them. And today, Marty, thank you so much for taking the time to share some discoveries with us.
Bless you, Matt. I often say when friends introduce me, and this happens with you all the time, one should never allow especially good friends to introduce one for a lecture or a public event, because they build you up so much. Anything you say is pretty much certain to be an anticlimax after the build-up you've been given. And that's how I feel right now. Bless you, Matt. Thanks to what you've just done. But again, this is a two-part lecture, and there is so much material here. Again, Matt, of course, you and Cynthia never give yourselves the credit that is richly yours. I was swamped with the material on this. We had agreed, Matt and I had agreed on the basic structure of this a number of months even ago. But I found so much material and so many angles to go into that it was only in a conversation we had, I think just last week, wasn't it? Or the week before that, certainly very recently. We had a quite brief conversation, at least by my standards, on the phone. It was for less than an hour, which for me is brief. For those of you who want to engage me by phone, you've been warned. And I realized then the framework I needed. And it was what's a counterintuitive CI framework. The action part of this lecture, the crime and punishment, the law and order, the exciting part, the detective part of the lecture, will be next week. We will be going into the assassinations next week, the forensic analysis of the assassinations of Tsar Alexander II of Russia, and an apparently totally different event, a continent away, half a world away, in Buffalo, New York, almost exactly 20 years later. A little more than 20 years later, the assassination of President William McKinley at the World's Fair by Leon Czolgosz in 1901. And I started with the assassination. I was not looking to look at them both. I was not looking to link them. I came to the assassination of Tsar Alexander first. I had never seriously studied I had always taken for granted the conventional wisdom on the assassination of President McKinley. It was, in fact, the work of Anton himself and Cynthia, and of Anton Chaikin and of you, Matt, and the three of you, that really alerted me after I had looked at the assassination of Alexander II, to, for the first time in my life at my advanced age, to look at the assassination of of President McKinley. And I was quite frankly astonished at what I found. I expect to be astonished at what I haven't found yet, because quite literally 2 or 3 days ago, I found another dimension, which I will be discussing tonight, that I had not looked for. that I had not looked for. And I'd really looked for none of this. Having said that, where does this begin? We begin ostensibly at the Anarchist Conference in 1881 in London. The dates here are extremely important. Hold on a moment. I believe it was, yes, in July 14th to July 20th, 1881. A lot of things, as we shall see, happened in the first 7 months of 1881. And my old wonderful teacher, an old style Franklin Roosevelt liberal New Dealer, I believe still hopefully very much with us, my mentor half a century ago at Oxford, Professor William E. Luchtenberg, the world's leading expert in his lifetime, and still I hope, on the New Deal, emphasized in his graduate seminars at Oxford that I was privileged to attend, that chronology is the backbone of history. This is true when we're looking at longer periods of causality and patterns of rise and fall of nations and developments within nations. But it is also true, of course, within political processes that occur within weeks and months. It is crucially important to understand the sequence of events and how events apparently unconnected and often unlinked interact upon each other and motivate players to change their policy or initiate policies, as we shall see here. Now, in Germany, for the last 65 years, it has been common, and it's a very 75 years, it has been both moral and wise. The German people refer to 1945 as year zero for obvious reasons. It was a year when not just the Third Reich was annihilated, but when 75 and 80 or more years of united German nationalism based on militarism and conflict for war, both defensive and offensive alike, was annihilated. Germany was annihilated in 1945, which is what made the building from scratch of the new tolerant democratic Germany since 1945 so successful, because nothing was truly left of not just Hitlerine Germany of the Third Reich, but of the Second Reich, which had been an impressive and even admirable state in so many ways. But nothing of either was left. There was a year zero. Tonight, we are going to have to launch another year zero in terms of the interpretation of history. That is the year 1881. This is a year where we will find from this year zero ramifications of events that radiate back earlier for more than a century before this year zero, and that also continue to have ramifications today in Kazakhstan and in Russia and in Belarus today as a direct consequence of what happened in 1881. And we apply also here. I grew up in a Jewish background. I was biased against the Roman Empire and against Roman civilization and Roman thought. The older I get, the more I appreciate and I'm thankful for classical Roman thought. Not just the Greeks, who we have excellent cause to adore, but the Greeks were, as of all people, the late Chief Rabbi Joseph Hertz of the British Empire rightly said the Greeks were political idiots. The Romans were not. The Romans were great realists, and they brought quite a lot of justice, but often not justice. But even when they didn't bring justice, they certainly brought order and stability. They knew a great deal about that. They knew a great deal about that. And again, forgive me, I jump over the slight tangent there. But I was taught history at Oxford, and before that, even back in my school, classical Whig school in Belfast, the Whig interpretation of history, the Macaulay interpretation of history. Minimum government is always the best government. Britain and America are always virtuous. Democracy is always superior. Our version of democracy is the only legitimate version of democracy, against which all other forms of democracy or other forms of government must be judged and always weighed in the balance and found wanting whenever they disagree with us. And I agreed with this not only at the time, but for many decades afterwards. We now look at the way the assassination of Alexander II is taught to this day, not just in fine high schools and grammar secondary schools in Britain and America, but in Slavic study courses in the finest universities of both Britain and North America. And even at the time, I never questioned this, and yet it puzzled me. But I didn't question it until I came back to it very recently. After my years of interaction with Strategic Culture Foundation, and after my years of fruitful interaction with you, Matt, and with Cynthia, and with Anton, and with Finian Cunningham, who is still writing from the tiny island of freedom that Ireland thankfully still is, in SCF. And here is the puzzle. The conventional wisdom we are taught is Alexander II of Russia, like his grandfather Alexander I, was a great reformer. This is acknowledged. He freed the serfs. But then, so the conventional wisdom goes, he turned to reaction. And when he turned to reaction, he became hated. And when he became hated, he responded with repression. And the more he repressed, the more he was hated, and then he was hunted down and he was killed. And the impression one is given is that he was killed because he had isolated himself from the Russian people and intelligentsia and the Russian ruling classes, and everybody hated him. And this is what is believed to this day. And the group, sure enough, that killed him sounds like a democratic group of outraged peasants. Narodnaya volya, the people's will. Except it wasn't. Narodnaya volya, as I have written in my articles, and you can see them in Strategic Culture Review and refer back to them, is a puzzle. Because it wasn't a mass movement at all, and it had nothing to do with peasants at all. It was a tiny conspiratorial group that, even including its most passive protected members, who only existed as safe houses to hide and keep people secretly, there were never more than 200 people involved. And yet it carries out half a dozen assassination attempts on supposedly the most powerful man in the world with impunity over a 3-year period. And it is relentless. And this great liberal czar, the czar who freed more human beings than any other person in history has done. Even Nikita Khrushchev frees 4 million people from the Gulag in 1954-55. I have a chapter on him in my yet to be published. Now, I throw this out every time. I still am looking for a publisher for this. If anyone can network for me for a publisher for my book, Unlikely Angels, on human rights heroes who rescued hundreds of thousands, even millions of people from genocides around the world, tell me, because I need a publisher. I cannot get it published. Are you surprised? I suspect in this audience, most of you are not surprised at all, because it's too easy to be politically incorrect in a brainwashed world. As George Orwell, who I had both the fortune and misfortune, you understand, to revere and believe in, and I still do. That's the problem. That's both the fortune and the misfortune. Orwell is one of the finest human beings, I believe, and finest minds, political minds who ever lived. And it is precisely, therefore, that is the reason if you take him seriously, you will run into conflict in your life. You will be questioning powerful established forces and evil idiots on every side. And that's just the price you pay for having your own version of peace of mind. That will happen. Now, here, the conundrums around the murder of Alexander II continue to rise. The Narodnaya volya is not a revolutionary mass movement. It is a tiny, almost invisible group with only 40 or 50 activists in it. No major apparent funding to it, and yet it operates with total impunity against the most oppressive, certainly the largest, and supposedly the most efficient repressive secret police force in the world at that time for 3 years, until they succeed in murdering the Tsar. And yet after that, they are totally rolled up and arrested and rightly executed within 2 or 3 weeks afterwards. They pose no long-term revolutionary threat, but more. The Tsar, it turns out, was not unpopular at all. The peasants loved him. They loved him when he was alive, and they loved him when he was dead. We see, incidentally, a parallel situation in the United States, where 2 presidents who have been sneered at by elitist liberal East Coast historians for a century and more were utterly revered in their own lifetime. Actually 3. One of them who lived to die a natural death, of course, President Grant, who had the most spectacular and popular funeral in American history, that in its scale of mourning and in its scale in New York City, in the reduced American population of 1881, dwarfed in scale the mourning events for President Lincoln, for Franklin Roosevelt, and even for John F. Kennedy. Take a look at, just, you can do it even while I talk. Take a look at a couple of the photographs of literally 600,000 former veterans of the United States Army in the Civil War marching through the streets of Manhattan in New York City in tribute to President Ulysses S. Grant. It is extraordinary. And you also find equal levels of intense mourning throughout the nation for President William McKinley. By contrast, when Theodore Roosevelt dies in 1920, nobody gives a damn. He's already recognized as an absurd old fart, even though he was less than 60 years old when he died. He was ludicrously out of date after World War I, which he had endlessly agitated for, as those and rising tide through Matt. I've done a presentation on Teddy Roosevelt. I recommend those of you who haven't been it, go on it, swell my extremely modest viewing numbers, but the demolition job on him was crucial and necessary too. But when Teddy Roosevelt, who is now this great mythic figure, of course, the presiding archangel of American exceptionalism, the justification for us to revert in a nuclear age, there is nothing more dangerous than to revert to the childish Boy Scout idiot fantasies of Theodore Roosevelt in a thermonuclear age. And we have done so. But when he died, he was obsolete, nobody cared. But when Warren Harding died in 1923, the mourning was immense, even though he had only been in the White House for 3 years. He had never tried to be a president in a heroic scale like John Kennedy. He did not try. He was an easygoing, kindly figure. And this was revered in America at the time because he was such a relief and a change from Teddy Roosevelt and from Woodrow Wilson, from both of them. And from that matter, for a much more admirable man, William Jennings Bryan. But none of the three of them, they were all big, fat, pompous jerks. None of them would ever shut up. And Bryan, at least, was a genuinely good, well-meaning man who understood the importance of restraint. Teddy Roosevelt did not, and of course, Woodrow Wilson did not at all. So I'm venturing out here. But as I say, next week we will go to these two assassinations, half a world away, 20 years apart, apparently so different. And yet we will find in their not just in the methodology, but in the individuals who are actively and clearly involved in orchestrating and directing and being in deeply suspicious contact with the assassins at first hand in both cases. The extraordinary parallels. In other words, what do we have to conclude from this? We have to conclude the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in March 1881 was a prototype event, and it was then duplicated in other countries. And there was a cover put on it. And the ultimate duplication, which actually led to a backfire which the conspirators did not remotely expect in the United States against them, led to the extinguishing of the anarchist movement in the United States and then across the world as well in 1901, as we shall see next week, and the rise instead of democratic socialism in the United States, which succeeded where anarchism had always failed and was always going to fail, and was non-violent and non-revolutionary in sharp contrast to anarchism. All of this we shall see. But as I say, we go back to 1881. In March, on 13th of March, 1881, the great Tsar is assassinated by anarchists. There's no question that anarchists are behind it. Everybody acknowledges this at the time. It is a shocking and monstrous event. We will go into the gruesome details in detail next week. We will probably not be able to avoid them this week too. For the ladies present especially, I apologize on that, but the viciousness and personal cruelty of the individuals who are involved in these crimes, especially that particular crime, really do need to be emphasized to bring out the kind of people who are involved in doing this. But this is March the 13th, 1881. What happens after it? There is an anarchist convention held in July of that year. March the 13th, April 1, May 2, June 3, 4 months almost to the day, 4 months and 1 day after Tsar Alexander II has his innards blown open and his legs blown off in the streets of St. Petersburg, after he's insisted of getting out of an armored carriage where he was safe, in order to give condolences to dying and seriously injured Russian police officers who had been killed and mutilated in a previous assassination attempt on him a few minutes before. And when he gets out of his carriage, an idealistic young woman, Sophia Andreevna, several hundred yards up the street, raises her hand in a signal, and it is a signal for a second assassin to throw the bomb. Incidentally, there is another interesting methodology here. We see this same pattern of these events in 1914 in Sarajevo, where there is an assassination attempt on the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, and it is foiled. But the Archduke, again, being tragically idealistic and wedded to his duty, a fatal mistake of these stupid Habsburgs, right, insists on going on with his schedule. And therefore, of course, there is a second assassin, Gavrilo Princip, waiting for him along the predicted line of advance. And there are other questions about the 1914 assassination too, which we should investigate at some point. But my point here is this monstrous assassination of not just the most powerful man and emperor in the world at the time, but also a man who had freed 24 million people from slavery. When Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Declaration, it eventually led to the freeing of 4 million slaves in America, chattel slaves. And we rightly revere Lincoln for that act, apart from everything else he did, to this day, and rightly so. The great Tsar freed 6 times that many people, 20 million more people from servitude than Lincoln had done, and they loved him for the rest of their lives. He was not unpopular with the Russian people. Nor was he unpopular with the large number of clerks in Russia either. So I find myself asking, even as a young student, but then why are we reading that he was unpopular? He had industrialized Russia. He had succeeded in industrializing Russia. The industrialization of Russia continued under his domestically reactionary son, Alexander III, who in this area continued his father's policies and did not reverse them. And Alexander III and his son, Nikolai II, had an outstanding finance minister, who I know you and Cynthia know about backwards, the great Count Sergei Witte, a man who as late as 1914 fights to prevent Russia being sucked into the catastrophe of World War I. He's one of the great unsung heroes of Russian history to this day. So I find myself asking, how could Narodnaya Volya represent the will of the people when there are only 50 or so active members in it? How could it operate with impunities for so long? Right? And how could it be rolled up so easily after the assassination of the Tsar, when they had tried with impunity to kill the Tsar 6 or 7 times in the previous 3 years? Endless questions. But now we have another question. The greatest empire in the world, even larger than Russia's, an empire in many respects much more conservative than Russia's, because it rules not just over its own ethnic peoples, but over enormous populations in Asia and Africa of other nations. A ruling establishment in London that hates and fears revolution. And yet they have been a home to Karl Marx when he's writing Das Kapital. And they provide a home consistent with this to Mikhail Bakunin's successor and the second leader of international anarchism from 1876 onward. He succeeds Bakunin on his death smoothly, Prince Peter Kropotkin. Now, Kropotkin is not who he appears to be. And now we come back to Barbara Tuchman, who I was warming up with before. Tuchman was a New York-based Jewish liberal writer who, after World War II, hit it big as a writer of enormous popular histories of the 19th century. She wrote a major book in the 20th century. Her books are enormous, 600 to 1,000 pages routinely, but she writes fluidly. It's easy to read her. She can tell a story. She can organize facts, or what appear to be facts, very convincingly. I have never had the sense that Barbara Tuchman ever told a lie. I have always had the sense that she was conventionally, simply exceptionally stupid. Now, of course, you can't say that about a liberal Jewish writer who has been involved in what was otherwise admirable work in rescuing the literary records of the Jewish community, secular Jewish community in Vilna, Lithuania, after the Holocaust. And she's liberal, and she believes in all the good things. And she writes this enormous bestseller book in the early 1960s called A Recreation of Different Events in 19th Century Europe, fin de siècle, end of century Europe. And it's a beautifully written book. And it really does get you back into the feel of that time. It's called The Proud Tower. And it's an enormous bestseller. It sells like hotcakes. You'll probably find it sells in its millions, certainly in its hundreds of thousands. And it is so powerful that 60 years after it was written, it still shapes major perceptions to this day. In many areas, accurately, but in other areas, not. She has a separate section on the anarchist movement and Prince Peter Kropotkin. What does she write about the anarchist movement? It is basically a reaction to mass industrialization. The anarchists who carry out propaganda of the deed, which is to say murder, the assassination of national leaders, are driven to it by desperation from their miserable backgrounds. That is what she writes. It is a democratic movement. It is disorganized. It is free and open to all, right? Which, of course, is why it never succeeds in the end when the bad Marxists, who she doesn't approve of, well, who should, I think, but when they get together, right? Because her version of anarchism is it's warm, it's lovable, it's open, it's inclusive, it's chaotic, it's friendly, it's democratic. It isn't. It isn't, because when you actually look at the police records, it's very interesting. The anarchists are also able to hide behind the fact that Marxists hate them. And Marxists won and established the Soviet Union. And then, of course, took over in China too, but the Soviet Union was where the Comintern was. And it had huge intellectual influence in the United States and Western Europe through the first half of the 20th century. And the Trotskyites too were Marxists and take Marxism enormously seriously. And the Trotskyites, like the regular Stalinist communists and post-Stalin communists, are opposed to the anarchist movement. So paradoxically, they play into Tuchman's hands and the hands of the other people who are protectors of the anarchists. Because the Marxists and the Russian communists are hostile and critical to the anarchists and critical of them, therefore the anarchists must be good. That's basically the subconscious feeling that sweeps people. And Tuchman certainly falls for it. So in The Proud Tower, she is championing Kropotkin and the anarchists as kinder, gentler revolutionaries than these big bad Marxists who led to Lenin and to Stalin. That's where she's coming from, right? Now she's wrong, you see. She has fallen for a lie. She has fallen for a myth. And yet, such is the miserable state of debate, the lack of open debate, which I think comes as no surprise to everyone or almost everyone here at this seminar, but and especially not to Matt and Anton and Cynthia or Gerald, Stephen, of course not. The truth is the opposite of what it appears to be. because you're looking at a lie that makes no sense, because you're not looking at the material. All the historical critical work that has surfaced in the last 40 or 50 years in anarchism has not been done by the right, it's been done by the left, but it's been done by the Marxist left. And these are all theoreticians. The key evidence they ignore. They're ignorant that it's there. Why? What is this key evidence and where is it? It is the records in police intelligence files and security service files and records of the governments of the nations of Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and the United States. And what do they all tell us? They are consistent. They describe anarchist movements that are never popular movements, that are always tiny, elitist, secretive cells that are centrally controlled from one central international headquarters. And usually they don't even know where that headquarters was. But we now, with the benefit of hindsight, know exactly where it was. It was hiding in plain sight. And I have another advantage now I did not have when I first started reading about this stuff in the 1960s and 70s. Well, twofold advantage. First, simply, I've lived longer. I've seen a lot more in my life. And I've been a working journalist. And I've covered patterns of terrorism. No terrorist movement can survive anywhere internationally unless it has a safe base of operations. And that safe base of operations must be a significant empire or nation state with sufficient power and resources to protect this movement. Why should it do so? It does so for two reasons. First, to destroy its enemies, and secondly, to protect itself. Because the terrorist movement and the protecting bodies that protect it have entered into a Faustian relationship with each other. They've made a Faustian compact, a deal with the devil for each of them from their very different perspectives. We will protect you if you do not try to kill us. You can kill anybody else around the world with impunity, and you will especially kill people we finger for you to do us favors. That's the rent you pay for your continued protection. Now, I did not come to this understanding of the anarchist movement for 40 years. But from the 1970s, I already saw this movement in practice. It is how the Palestine Liberation Organization and the PFLP and other Palestinian terrorist groups were able to operate with impunity, not just against Israel, but against pro-Israeli forces in the world as well. You can also argue we're not just making points against the PLO. If you look at assassinations that enormously fed into the American national interest, there was one in particular I recommend that you look at. The murder of King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, the driving force behind the OPEC oil embargo in 1975. And who did it? One of his nephews. Well, in the Saudi royal family, if you have so many wives and children and cousins, you're going to have lots of nephews, hard to keep track of them all. And this particular one had gone to California, liked lots of girls, more importantly, liked lots of drugs, and therefore could easily be conditioned, just as another Arab useful idiot Scapegoat Wars, Sirhan, who has just been denied yet again parole for the murder of Senator Robert Kennedy in 1968. A crime which he most certainly did not commit, because the forensic evidence of the sounds of shots fired in the Ambassador Hotel in LA on that fateful night are quite conclusive on this. Quite conclusive. But again, patterns of assassination. They can only be continued. You can have a one-off and people crack down on it, and it doesn't happen again. But when you have repeated patterns following the same pattern, and they go on, they can only go on because there is a protective base. And what is the one country, one major nation in the world, one major empire in the world, the only one which did not suffer from not just one, but a whole spate of assassinations of prominent national leaders from 1878 all the way through into the 20th century. In other words, during the precise period Peter Kropotkin ran the Anarchist International. It was the British Empire, of course. And where was Kropotkin living all those years? Why, he was living in Britain. And he lived a comfortable, ostensibly modest life. But he was able to travel around the world to major nations as a major and respected scientist of the day. There was a lot of debate about the kind of scientist he was. A ridiculous little book that I recommend you all to read, because it is such a terrible book and uncritical nonsense that you cannot believe I'm calling it this unless you read it yourselves and you see what childish bilge it is. It is called The Prince of Evolution. It only came out a year or two ago. And it glorifies Kropotkin's so-called science. He's not a Darwinian. He's an anti-Darwinian. But like Charles Darwin, he makes the same huge, stupid mistake. And Adam Smith makes the same mistake. All those 18th and 19th century polymaths think they can solve everything just like that, with a single principle, a single idea. Tolstoy, who was prone to very much the same weakness, nevertheless has enough self-understanding as a novelist. He's a great writer, a great novelist. Of course, as a political thinker, he's an idiot. And as a human being, he's a repulsive, ludicrous, pompous jerk. But there's no question that when Tolstoy writes novels, he writes the best novels that anyone has ever written in human history. And Tolstoy, therefore, comes up with this fantasy of the ancient Russian folktale of the green stick, which the great British writer Malcolm Muggeridge, in his Chronicles of Wasted Time, uses it as the title of one of his volumes of wonderfully witty and wise autobiography. The green stick is the myth that somewhere in the endless Russian forest, there is a magical green stick, and if you find it, you can put all Pandora's troubles back in the box. It is the one magical solution to all the woes and suffering and problems and complexities of humanity. And of course, the Marxists believe this, and the Nazis believe this. And therefore, they are justified in killing as many people as they like, because everybody who stands in the way of their possession of the magical green stick is obviously an enemy of humanity and must be exterminated. And Kropotkin believes this too. He is not a Darwin, but he is an anti-Darwin. His solution is all government is always evil. Simple, isn't it? When Eve spun, when Adam sowed and Eve span, who was then the gentle? When Adam hunted and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? This was a song sung in the German peasants' revolt in the 1520s, a revolt, incidentally, that killed literally millions of people, millions of human beings, again in the name of eternal happiness and bringing peace on earth. My own late revered teacher, Isaiah Berlin, who regarded himself as a man of the left, but a man of the social democratic, moderate left. He was a very interesting example in complexity himself. He married a Rothschild, but he was personally incorruptible. He loved Britain and was loyal to it all his life, but he hated the British Empire and rejoiced when India became free, and worked tirelessly for Britain's former African colonies to become free too. Berlin, in his political thought, makes the central point that any attempt to impose a utopia, whether of the left or the right, on all of the human race is bound to create hell on earth rather than heaven. Instead, it is inevitable because of the variation and complexity within the human race and human culture. He makes the point that not only are we different from each other, but in our own minds, we are different from ourselves. We have different conflicting layers. Each of us do in our own mind, from our fathers, from our mothers, from our ethnic backgrounds, from how we were raised, from how we were educated. And this is even before you attach the theology, the idea of reincarnation, which is still believed by at least 2 billion people, including myself, in the world, which is an inconvenience to traditional Christianity in particular. Though the Catholic Church, to its credit, has over the centuries, I think, adapted much better to it than the Protestant fundamentalists have. But again, I digress widely on this. Berlin's central point is that if you have any simplistic idea and you impose it as the only way for humanity to achieve eternal human happiness, you will have Stalin, you will have Hitler, you will have Mao, you will have hecatombs of dead. that actually also applied in the 19th century to liberal internationalism, which astonished me when I started to look at that several years ago. But it is also consistent with what happened in Russia in 1881 and what happened in London in 1881. Now at last we come to the central point of year zero, 1881. On March the 13th, 1881, the great Tsar is assassinated by the anarchist movement in Petersburg. It is almost immediately claimed in Britain as being an example of the genuine people's will. They take Narodnaya Volya at their literal name. In fact, there is revulsion at this. We're far from setting off revolution, as the idiots who killed the Tsar imagined. They are all rounded up within days, and they all go to a scaffold afterwards. One of them, a fascinating individual, is the man who designed, decades ahead of its time, the special shrapnel grenade that quite literally eviscerated the legs and body of the Tsar. And he's a coward. He doesn't want to hang. He doesn't want to die. So he offers a deal to the Tsarist authorities. In 1881, 22 years before the Wright brothers fly, nearly 23 years actually. And he says to them, if you spare me, I am an expert on rocket technology, which he was. I will build you successful manned aircraft that will give Russia military dominance over the world. And I will even get you into space and to the moon and back, like Jules Verne said. I can build and design those rockets for you if you spare my life. To the great credit of the Russian authorities and Tsar Alexander III, who had had many policy differences and clashes with his father, but he was still his father's son, the Russian authorities very rightly resist this very Faustian temptation, and they publicly hang the bastard. And there are protest movements in London and New York to protest the barbarity of the Russian authorities for hanging the individuals who were responsible for the murder of the Tsar. Does that sound modern? It's classic modern liberalism to this day. 4 months and 1 day after these events, the anarchist movement that openly claimed and took credit for the murder of Tsar Alexander II is permitted by the Imperial British government in London to hold a 7-day convention in London. It is the first anarchist international. That act alone, had Russia not been enfeebled, both by its humiliation by the British and French a few years before, in the 1877 to 1879 crisis in the Congress of Berlin, that event alone could have set off, was justification for a new major world war between Russia and Britain. Except, as the British correctly understood, the Russians were in no position or preparation to give one. But the British are openly hosting the murderers of the Tsar, and they allow them to have a 6-day convention. What happened at that convention? Again, historiography misleads, because today the convention is totally forgotten. And if you take a look online at the bibliography for it, you will find a bit of stuff. It's all very obscure, but it's there. But what does the bibliography talk about? It is written by Marxists. Up to the 1960s and 70s, nobody's really bothered writing anything since then. But from the 1900s onwards, Marxists are still obsessed with the anarchists as the brother, the twin brother they had to kill and succeed. And we are right and you are wrong. It's like early Christians dumping on the Jews, or early Christians dumping on heresies who they have then exterminated, right? You cannot resist jumping on the bones of the dead, especially on ideological arguments. So Marxists keep saying about the early anarchists, look at these arguments they made. Look at this theoretical basis. They couldn't understand the dialectic. Their dialectic was very weak. They hadn't read Proudhon properly. Bakunin is a bungling idiot. And they make the very bad mistake of assuming that Kropotkin is an illiterate, right? Now, Kropotkin is a joke as a scientist, though his pretensions to science are very important. When he's dealing with the illiterate fools who follow him, the fact, oh, he's a scientist, wow. You know who says this most explicitly? A very important figure in American history who's been improbably revived to this day, Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman, since the 1950s and 60s, has been revived as one of the great feminist saints of American history. She was actually an anarchist. She championed birth control. She championed women's rights and women's equality. This is true. She did not do anything effective to get any of them done. She was too violent, selfish, idiotic. She once shot and nearly killed one of her own lovers in a lover's dispute. She is also the key individual on behalf of Peter Kropotkin, and they were clearly lovers too later on in Kropotkin's life. Goldman personally, as we shall see next week, trained and organized and instructed Leon Czolgosz and gave him the gun with which he assassinated President William McKinley. In other words, she played the role that Zofia Andrzejewna had previously played for Kropotkin in preparing another Polish fall guy, Ignaś Reczny, or Grabinski, I think. We will look him up. His name is a mouthful in both Russian and Polish. But he is the guy who threw the fatal shrapnel grenade that eviscerated the Tsar in 1881. And he was directed by a young woman who had previously been deeply involved with Kropotkin in the Nikolai Tchaikovsky circle of anarchists in the early 1870s. I've documented this elsewhere. The curious thing is that there's never been a secret about the proximity of Kropotkin to Andrzejewna, but nobody has ever actually pointed it out before. It's very easy to do. Why? See why? Because the people who look at the anarchist movement were Marxist historians. And all they cared about was Marxist ideology. They are a Marxist equivalent of Christian theologians writing in the Middle Ages and early Middle Ages about the interminable arguments on theology from the Byzantine Empire through to the Crusades against the Albigensians in the 13th century. Millions of people died violently or were murdered by the Inquisition as a result of these intellectual theological arguments. But for the priests at the time and afterwards, all that mattered was the raw idea, the theology, the purity of the idea and the purity of the intellectual arguments. That's all that mattered to them. And in the same way for Marxists, when they look at the anarchists before them, they're hostile to the anarchists, but inadvertently they're absolving the anarchists because all they're looking at is the intellectual arguments of the anarchists, which even from a Marxian perspective can be easily exposed as superficial and childish rubbish. But they're not looking at what the anarchists actually did, and they're not looking at the real action that went on at the convention in 1881. What was the real action in the convention? It was methodology. And what do I mean by methodology? It was how to make bombs, how to train people to make bombs, how to acquire revolvers, how to train people to use revolvers, and how to keep this from the police. What you find again and again in police records throughout Western Europe in the late 19th century is that anarchist movements are not popular and do not seek to be popular. They are not large, they are tiny, and they are conspiratorial. The further you go to the center, the less harmless it becomes. But then you look at the popular image which the British happily gave to Peter Kropotkin for 40 years. Kropotkin lives a very long life. He lives to almost 80. He actually goes to the Soviet Union before he dies. He is acclaimed by Lenin. Emma Goldman, who loved him more than she ever loved any other man in her life very clearly, visits him in Petersburg and Moscow before he dies. And in her own records, it's clear she still reveres him. And her description of him then and earlier is very revealing. It's the description of an idiot talking about a phony who she has fallen for. Basically, she's a groupie of Charles Manson, and Peter Kropotkin is her Charles Manson. Before Peter understood the great movements of our time, the great sociological movements, the great economic and political movements, more than any other human being who has ever lived, she says. And also, he was one of the greatest scientists who has ever lived. He made Darwin obsolete. It was he who connected the realities of science and biology and showed how this is the basis of our politics. Now you see, the Marxists did something very similar. Do you see the switch that is being made here? It's creationism again. It's faking science and limiting science to justify your pre-existing simplistic political economic beliefs. What Kropotkin's biological belief is very simple. He believes in cooperation. Darwin says all life forms are in endless competition with each other. Now that's obviously an oversimplification. And Darwin says it in total ignorance of the first great geneticist, Mendel, who was incidentally a devout Christian monk who lives at the very time that Darwin is writing, but Darwin is totally ignorant of Mendel's work all his life and would want to be anyway, because Mendel disproves him. And all our own solid work in genetics and biology over the past 150 years flows from Mendel. Darwin does at least condition us to think in biological terms and adaptation to environments, and this is important and central and necessary. But he, at the very best, he's very oversimplistic and sweeping. But so is Kropotkin. Kropotkin says, look at the ants. They are a republic. They don't have any rulers. Now, that's not true. Ants are some of the most regimented species in life, in history. They have queens, they have armies, they have specialized different, every kind of ant and every anthill has many different segmented, organized, deeply regimented forces to build, to fight, to move, to carry out many different functions. They have deeply complex societies, and they are organized. They have government. We see, and we know now very well from many of the great biologists who have lived with gorillas and studied chimpanzees over the past century, different kinds of apes. And we see, I mean, even in a Disney movie like The Lion King, it is a fact in nature that lions will fight each other. It is a fact that pack dogs will fight each other, and that dogs that are defeated in fights will become loyal servants of the dogs that will then lead the fight. This is their version of politics. This is their version of the struggle for leadership and the struggle for competing ideas. It is ugly. It can be nature in the raw. There are many examples of cooperation and synergy in nature too. Of course there are. But to simply say there is no such thing as competition, that not only is Darwin wrong, but the reverse of Darwin is automatically right, as Kropotkin says. Kropotkin is a terrible scientist. He's sloppy, he's simplistic, he's sweeping, he's closed-minded. He never allows any fact which the great dissident author Charles Fort 100 years ago in New York City called damned facts, facts that do not fit into prevailing scientific orthodoxy of the day and are therefore damned by the ruling scientific orthodoxy of the day, which is why he called his first book of scientific anomalies the Book of the Damned. He's not praising the devil. He's not talking about theology or morality in any way. He's talking about human perception of facts that do not fit our pre-existing assumption of the facts. Remember that from Aristotle to the 19th century, including Galileo and Newton and Leibniz and all of them, nobody believed that stones fell from the sky until a scientist from the French Academy actually observed a bolide fall in France in 1804. And that broke the taboo that stones, now since stones not only fall from the sky, but since we have lots of documented evidence of meteorite bombardments even through historical times, I would maintain here, following Immanuel Velikovsky, that there is a terror of admitting that danger can come from the skies. And therefore, the taboo is a very deep psychological repression taboo, which goes deep into human nature. And of course, this fits with Darwin too, because Darwin assumes uniformity in geology as the basis for billions and billions of years for his very simplistic form of evolution to work. We know evolution exists. You can call it adaptation too. You can use different labels for it. But we know species develop and change and adapt dramatically. We now know through molecular biology that birds are that turkeys are descended from velociraptors and chickens are descended from Tyrannosaurus rex. Who could have, and the Tyrannosaurus rex had feathers. When I was growing up 50 years ago, you would have been laughed out of every civilized society for suggesting idiotic ideas like this. And yet we now know it to be objectively true. Reality is much more complex and sweeping than we give it credit for. But Kropotkin did not give it credit. Kropotkin lives in Britain with impunity until the Russian Revolution, when he is allowed to go to Russia. And he lives the rest of his life there. In his last recorded conversation with Emma Goldman, who was certainly a conventional anarchist, looks on the Soviet Union under Lenin, Stalin hasn't even taken over yet, with horror. She realizes that she could not carry out her murders, her attempted murders of ex-lovers, her wild, ludicrous lifestyle, for a second in the no-nonsense repressive world of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and his Communist Party. She is appalled at what the revolution has brought to Russia, and she says so to Kropotkin. How does Kropotkin reply? Darling Emma, you don't understand. You have to take the long-term view. This is the greatest event in human history. This is everything we have been working for. Yes, there have been these killings. Yes, there have been these mass slaughters, and there will be more and worse. There have to be. Because, and he's one of the first to use this cliche, which Stalin later adores, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. To which Alexander Solzhenitsyn later lastingly replied, yes, but after all these scores of millions of murders, I still see no omelet. I still see no omelet. But this was Kropotkin. Goldman, at least, was even a sincere anarchist. Kropotkin was not even that. Now, before I close, I want to give two radical ideas to you that are both, again, not solutions, but simply open doors, which both warrant and require huge study. First, both of them came to me unexpectedly too, not by revelation, but just because when you look at the material and you open your mind, after a lifetime of conditioning not to open your mind, if you ask the right question, very suggestive answers automatically pop up. First, it is a matter of record. And this has been documented by first-class British historians of British espionage, that Soviet penetration of the British security services, especially MI5, the counter-security service, was already totally effective by 1925. When the British security services raided a Soviet diplomatic house in London, the incriminating documents to show that the Soviet Union is already trying to encourage subversion and full-scale revolution in Britain, which they know have been there, have already been cleared away. In other words, they got word, and the only word they could have gotten it from was from within the British Secret Service. We even know who the likely individual was. A man who was a secret homosexual, which in those days was a big, big no-no, and was a number 2 man in the counterintelligence service for 30 years. His name was Guy Liddell. He ends up protecting Donald MacLean and the 3 spies and Kim Philby and the spies who flee in the early 1950s. He is not the 3rd man who was Sir Anthony Blunt. You could call him the 4th or the 5th man who protected all these people, all the Cambridge spies. But he was already the deputy director of MI5 in the 1920s, and the Soviets had effectively taken over the British counterintelligence service in 1925, and they effectively controlled it for the next, with their subversion people, through Roger Hollis's 10-year control of it from 1955 to 1965. That was why they were able to poison the anti-Soviet opposition leader Hugh Gaitskell with impunity in 1963. Which is something, and for those who doubt, there is endless detail on this and bibliography, which I can give you. But where did they get it from? Now, most conspiracy theories say, oh, Sidney Riley gave them the insight on the British Secret Service, and they kept him alive secretly. Well, there's no evidence that Riley survived. The Russians hated and feared him. He was an absolute amateur, though filled with loathing for them, for them to boot. It's very almost certain that Dzerzhinsky did have him shot out of hand when he lured him to Russia in 1925. And in any case, Riley would have had no direct access to the counterintelligence service. He was a low-level spook being directed by the MI6, or the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS. He would have had no access to MI5, a very different organization. And to this day, each organization has a very healthy, or unhealthy, if you prefer, distrust of each other. Riley has been made a mythological figure by the wonderful TV series in which he's played by a wonderful New Zealand actor, Sam Neill. Plays him, the same guy who actually plays a Russian later in The Hunt for Red October. But I would suggest here, first of all, as something to look at, when Kropotkin went back to Russia, what did he take with him? And what information was he able to give the founders, Felix Dzerzhinsky, and the founders of the Russian Secret Service? Because they were able to penetrate British intelligence much more rapidly and much more successfully than they were ever able to do for any other Western intelligence service. How? Why? Once you have your first people in, it's easy to direct them to give cover to other people you want to get recruited afterwards. But how does it start? Who are the first individuals? How do you know what goes on in there in the first place? There's a wonderful novel that's been written on this, setting it at a much later date and not remotely going as early as we've gone to. Many of you may be familiar with it. There have been excellent movie and TV adaptations made of it. Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy by John le Carré, a writer who, along with Philip Roth, I personally believe they were both much more worthy of winning the Nobel Prize for Literature than most of those people who've gotten it. But in both cases, they were too racy. Roth wrote too much and too wittily about sex, and le Carré wrote too wisely about author's life, about espionage and betrayal and lies. And these are not subjects that literary committees are happy with dealing with. But this is the first of two subjects that I want to lay on the table for future consideration, both as an institution at Rising Tide and for individuals to think about. Where did the Russian penetration of British counterintelligence begin, and who did it begin with? I suggest one looks at Kropotkin's last years in Moscow and what he did during those years. That is lesson one. Now we go back again to 1881. Because other things happened in 1881. First, another nationalist American president is assassinated in 1881. And the conventional wisdom, and this is a case I have not looked closely at, and I would much appreciate any input that Matt and Cynthia and Anton, especially, or any of you here, would have on this. And that is the murder of the President of the United States in 1881. A popular nationalist president, in the tradition of Lincoln and Grant, is stabbed to death by a placeholder who does have political connections to the more corrupt and pro-British wings of the Republican Party. Now, I don't have anything else to add to you on this. That is known and it's worth suggesting. But what I want to add to you now is a possible murder which would have been on even larger scale and ambition than the murder of the Tsar of Russia and then the murder of the President of the United States. Who could this be? Now, the murder of the assassination of the Tsar takes place on March the 13th, 1881. That very same month, a 76-year-old man falls ill in his estate outside London. His name is Benjamin Disraeli. He has been the long-time Prime Minister of Britain, the revered close friend of Queen Victoria, the political arch-enemy of Gladstone. He is succeeded as leader of the British Conservative Party, and eventually as Prime Minister, therefore, by Robert Gascoigne Cecil, Lord Salisbury. And it is Lord Salisbury who, for 40 years, from the early 1860s into the 20th century, succeeds his predecessor as Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston as the effective head of British intelligence subversive operations around the world. This cannot be emphasized strongly enough. When you look at the secession of the South in the United States, the three top individuals in British political power who are encouraging this movement are Lord Palmerston, who is still the Prime Minister until he dies at the age of 81 in 1865, all through the Civil War. William Ewart Gladstone, the founder of modern liberalism, whose enormous fortune, he would have been a billionaire in today's terms, was made by his own father as the largest slave trader in the world in the city of Liverpool. And Gladstone, who is revered as the champion of liberal democracy and internationalism in the world through his entire extremely long life. He too lives to nearly 90, and in 1896. He lives so long, you can actually listen to audio tapes of him. You can probably find them on YouTube. He has a repulsive, ludicrous voice, but it obviously impressed the poor adults in the British working class at the time. And as late as 1862, the People's William, the champion of democracy, as he claims to be, also a raving anti-Semite, largely because he hates Disraeli personally. The two of them loathed each other. There are some very good joint biographies of them both, which are very entertaining. Their mutual hatred is extraordinary. But Gladstone is a champion of the Confederacy. After Chancellorsville, one of Lee's most effective victories, a victory that threw Lincoln into despair, Gladstone gives a speech in Britain. He says, "It is very clear the Confederacy has developed an army. We must now, they have won victories. We must now ask," and remember, this is the former and future Prime Minister of the British Empire, the most powerful nation in earth, and the most powerful nation in recorded history to that point, with absolute command of the seas, the ability to flatten New York City and Boston and San Francisco at any point if they choose to do so. And what does this Gladstone then say? We must ask if the Confederacy has also created a nation. And this is why, after the bungled battle at Antietam, which is the nearest that idiot George McClellan can get to a victory, and even then he throws it away when it's handed to him on a plate against the overrated Robert E. Lee, Abraham Lincoln rightly seizes the moment to issue the Emancipation Declaration. And it's brilliant, because it isn't the effect it has on the South, and it isn't the effect it has on the North that is of world historical history. In fact, it is the effect that it has on the British working class, who actually, God help them, really believe they have been emancipated, really believe they are free against all the objective evidence to the contrary, when they are being enslaved more thoroughly than ever in their 1,000-year-long history. But they believe this. And therefore Gladstone and Lord Salisbury and Lord Palmerston dare not go against such overwhelming popular opinion and recognize the Confederacy. And for the rest of his long life, Lord Salisbury, who lives into his 80s, regrets this. And 40 years later, looking back on the American Civil War, he says, he doesn't say Lincoln was a genius, Lincoln was a benefactor of mankind, Britain and America are brothers and cousins and allies and must join each other, which Teddy Roosevelt and Rudyard Kipling and their ilk all fell for the line, head over sinker. No, Lord Salisbury, who was the uncle of another British Prime Minister, Lord Balfour, who later becomes Foreign Secretary as well. Lord Salisbury says, damn it, we had the opportunity of a millennium to destroy and dismember the United States 40 years ago, and we did not take it. Now, there is a natural friend and ally for the United States. Wouldn't you think? Wouldn't you think? This is what we're dealing with. So, to sum up here, before we sum up though, here is Disraeli, and Disraeli is different because Disraeli is hard to predict. Disraeli is a genuine conservative. And while he never makes common cause with the Tsar, in fact, he outplays the Tsar at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, but he develops a remarkably profound friendship at the Congress of Berlin Does anyone else here know yet the friendship I'm referring to? Who becomes Dizzy's best friend for life at the Congress of Berlin?
Don't say Bismarck.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, no.
Der alte Jude, das ist der Mensch. This is what Prince Otto says afterwards. He thinks so highly of Disraeli that for the rest of his life, he has a portrait of Disraeli in his own private study, Bismarck. Because Bismarck, like Disraeli, is a genuine ideological conservative. He believes in a national Germany. He believes in industrial Germany. He is not a free trader. Neither is Disraeli. Disraeli is an economic illiterate. But he starts his career as a protectionist, wanting to protect England, strangely enough, from the flood of cheap imports from the United States, which his best friend, Lord George, mental block, please somebody look it up for me, leader of the Conservative Party from 1846 to 1850, a man who drops dead of a heart attack, which probably really is a heart attack, given the kind of fiery fellow he was. But he is also brilliant in terms of looking at business and economics, because he's a landowner like Bismarck is, and he's not a dilettante in economics and business like most professional politicians, including both Gladstone and Disraeli, are at the time, or like American politicians are today. You find when landowners who have major estates and major financial interests in their estates become national leaders, it's the same as with Donald Trump. They are actually economically literate. Whatever mistakes they make in other areas, when it comes to business, 2 and 2 makes 4, 4 and 4 makes 8, 8 minus 7 makes 1, 8 minus 10 makes minus 2, and you're bankrupt. This is very simple, but you actually have to be an experienced businessman to do this. The idiotic, contemptible New York Times and its columnists sneer at Donald Trump when he was running for the presidency, because Trump had several times successfully declared bankruptcy and then reinstated himself afterwards. And the conventional liberal line, which shows what idiots the Democrats are, the cloud cuckoo land they live in, is, how can you possibly have a man who declared bankruptcy as president of the United States? Well, since the United States government has been effectively bankrupt since the disastrous welfarism of the 1960s. Jerry's ahead of me as always. You know exactly what the punchline is, don't you? That's exactly the kind of man who will be the ideal president of the United States. Since America is bankrupt, you want a man who has handled bankruptcy and come out of it alive and reestablished his fortune afterwards. That's exactly the kind of man you want to run America. Not some idiotic, moralistic Harvard, Yale, over-protected, stupid little theoretical free trade jerk. Now in Britain, the Cobden Free Trade Treaty is signed in 1860. And the Cobden Free Trade Treaty is consistent with letting Karl Marx work freely in the British Museum, and it's consistent with letting Peter Kropotkin run the Anarchist International for 40 years, because this is where we finish. We finish with the British government having as its crucial ally the anarchist movement that slaughters every major national leader it can reach, who stands in the way of British free trade dominating and crushing the world. They oppose the industrialization of Russia. They oppose the industrialization of Germany. Until Bismarck and War Minister Roon and Army Chief of Staff, the first and great Moltke, quite rightly tighten up their security and make it the model for the world. There are 2 serious assassination attempts within 1 year in 1878 against Kaiser, and 1879 against Kaiser Wilhelm I. And there is also an assassination attempt, a serious one, against Bismarck himself at the same time. And who does all this? Why, anarchists, of course. The same people who killed the Prime Minister of Spain and the King of Italy, and Sadi Carnot, President of France. Who am I leaving out, Matt? I know there are others. There is a pattern to the people who the anarchists kill, and it is the opposite of the Barbara Tuchman myth again. All the leaders they kill, starting with President McKinley, and ending with President McKinley and starting with the great Tsar, all the people they kill are leaders who have improved the standard of living of their own populations. It is McKinley who was the first American president to intervene on behalf of trade union workers who are striking, miners no less, the most oppressed and miserable people in American history, and he forces the mine owners to make an equitable solution to the major mine strikes that are crippling the American economy in the 1890s and that significantly improved the standard of living of the miners. And as a result, the miners and all the industrial workers vote for McKinley in a landslide in 1900, even more overwhelmingly than in 1896. We see a parallel, by the way, in the 2020 election in the United States, where President Donald Trump's proportion of both Hispanic and African-American voters was higher than it was in 2016. And even in 2016, both those segments of the population who were supposed to hate Trump as a supposedly anti-Black and anti-Hispanic racist, which of course he was not in either case, voted for him in greater numbers than had ever voted in the history of the Republican Party before. And you will never see this acknowledged in the Washington Post or the New York Times or the liberal intellectual superstructure in the universities and academic institutions. You will never see it acknowledged. And finally, again, the last suspicious and tragic death of 1881. We have had two so far. We have had the Tsar, we have had the President of the United States after less than a year in office, only a few months in office, before he's had a chance to do anything, right? And now we have Benjamin Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli is in poor health. It's not surprising that he dies. He's 75, 76 years old, but he has always had great vitality. And we now know from genetic studies that he actually illegitimately begat a daughter, and he didn't have to rape the young lady to do it, as Palmerston routinely did. The British Empire was ruled by a serial rapist for 40 years, Palmerston. Palmerston dies, and again, the English look history in the face and refuse to see it. Palmerston dies raping a terrified young house servant who's only in her teens or her early 20s at the time. And he's 81, and the pleasure is too much for him when he drops dead on her and he has to be prized off her. Because this has been his normal behavior. This is the behavior of aristocratic English lords who are liberals, who are Whigs. Princess Diana, incidentally, comes from a family that was notorious for such libertine behavior over hundreds of years. Over hundreds of years. But nobody sees anything wrong with this. The reaction to this day is, oh, old Palmerston, he's a bit of a lad, you know? He's a bit of a lad, you know, good luck to him. Being capable of doing that, of raping a girl in her 80s? Boy, I wish I could do that. Well, personally, I don't, of course. I hasten to add. But that was the attitude at the time of the British public, even before the Daily Mail people thought the way the Daily Mail wanted them to think. And this is very important. But Disraeli is an ambiguous man. He has run the British Empire, but Lord Salisbury, who for nearly 20 years now has succeeded Palmerston as Foreign Secretary in Conservative governments and as permanent leader of the deep state in Britain, of British soft and subversive power around the world, has never liked or trusted Disraeli. He thought Disraeli came too near war with Russia when it was unnecessary and risked it over the Congress of Berlin. But now he is even more alarmed because Disraeli is making common cause with Bismarck. And Disraeli is perfectly capable of copying. Disraeli has written a book 30 years earlier, and he talks about the two nations in Britain, the North and the South, the rich and the poor. It's the kind of book you'd expect a Marxist revolutionary to write, and instead it's written by the architect of Tory populism, the man who made the Conservative Party a party of the masses in Britain, because he said the Liberal Party is not on your side, we the Conservative Party are. And during his 6-year classic premiership from 1874 to 1880, more acts of legislation are passed to lift the burden of suffering of the English industrial class, working classes, than have ever been passed before in history. And Gladstone and the Liberals, who are the champions of liberal middle class property, and of minimum government oppose every one of them. My old teacher, Isaiah Berlin, again I come to, was a lifelong social democrat. He called himself a liberal, but he was an old-fashioned liberal who was really a social democrat. He was not a libertarian. He hated and despised all libertarians as both contemptible and absurd. And this is how he put it. He was a very enthusiastic fly fisherman, freshwater fisherman. So he puts it in these terms. Berlin has this wonderful faculty of taking the most profound political and philosophical contexts and putting them in terms of his favorite cakes and his favorite fishing experiences. He says, freedom for the trout is freedom to eat the sprat and the sardine. Freedom for the sardine and the sprat is freedom from being eaten by the large predator fish. You have to make that distinction. You have to understand that. It is not the same freedom for both of them. Which freedom are you going to support? You cannot just say, that idiot Mel Gibson does in his movies, freedom, freedom, slaughter all the people, make every Englishman look like a Nazi, freedom, freedom, that's Mel Gibson, right? No, no. Freedom is social democracy. Freedom is the New Deal, not the Green New Deal, which is the opposite of the New Deal. Freedom is raising the standards of living of ordinary people in 21st century China or 1930s America. That's real freedom. That's real freedom. And then Disraeli dies. He dies right after, he falls sick for the last time, right after the murder of the Tsar. And he dies in April 1881. And had he lived, the Anarchist International, I maintain, would never have been allowed to meet in London. Queen Victoria didn't want it to. She was no fool. She was a very simplistic person. But I've met the current queen several times. In both cases, very much like her great famous ancestor. Very simple, straightforward intellects, but not to be despised for that reason. Both capable of and always able to practice elemental common sense, and precisely because they haven't been brainwashed by the fake sophistication of modern intellectual universities or backgrounds. They're capable of seeing things much more clearly in many respects. Queen Victoria did not approve of the murderers of kings. She did not approve of revolutionaries, nor did Disraeli. And Disraeli was so close to Queen Victoria that there were even, of course, conspiracy theories claiming that they made love to each other many times. Now, there's no hints that that actually ever happened, if only because possibly Queen Victoria was capable of it. She may well have had intimacy with with John Brown, her gillie, her Scottish groundskeeper in later years. He was certainly close to her and quite intimate with her in public physically. But in the case of Disraeli, Disraeli simply knew how to flatter the Queen, and she loved being flattered. And they were both at a very gut instinctual level conservative people. And they're also lonely people, because Disraeli, although he always played the field and had many infinite number of girlfriends, and in his youth boyfriends too, he had dearly and deeply loved his wife and never recovered from her death, and tended her solicitously, even as the most powerful man in the world, arguably. He spent more time looking after his dying wife, and it's a deeply moving account of him. And Queen Victoria, of course, never recovered from the loss of her beloved consort, Prince Albert. So these are deeply romantic and sensitive individuals who, in a bizarre but touching way, do find each other, which means the Queen would do what Disraeli advised her to do. And even as leader of the opposition, Disraeli would not have allowed, and I don't think this argument has ever been made by anyone before, linking the death of Disraeli with the highly convenient lack of opposition to the holding of the Anarchist Convention in London in July 1881, and this is crucial. Because the 1881 convention does many things. It legitimizes the assassins who killed the great Tsar. It makes the political point, look, we in Britain are a great conservative empire, but we are just, we are virtuous. We can afford to be magnanimous to the anarchists. We can allow political toleration, and therefore the future, the coming 20th century, will be ours. Whereas you, evil Russian imperialists, you're going to be destroyed in the 20th century. Well, of course they are, because the British are going to make damn sure that they're destroyed. It's an enormous act of political propaganda, and it's an enormously successful one. But it also does a third thing. The British are actually in terror of revolution, not so much from their own people, but from Ireland. In 1881, Liberal Prime Minister Gladstone's own son-in-law, who was Chief Secretary for Ireland, is murdered, stabbed to death by Irish revolutionaries in Phoenix Park in Dublin. It's known to this day as the Phoenix Park murders. They were historical research seems to suggest they weren't after Gladstone's son-in-law. They were after his right-hand man, who was involved in suppressing the Irish Republican revolutionaries very mercilessly too at the time. But as is so often the case in hypocritical empires like the Victorians or the Edwardians stumbling into World War I, there is always the tragedy of your own children and grandchildren. You could say John Kennedy was a victim of this as well. People who come from the cynical elite, but have been given idealistic educations, and God help them, they're good men. They believe the idealistic nonsense that they're not meant to believe. President Kennedy is murdered because he isn't a good man. Now, his father, Joseph P. Kennedy, wasn't a good man at all. He was a most contemptible man. But JFK was not like his father. He was not like his father. He really believed in democracy and coexistence with the Soviet Union and saving the human race and dismantling the colonial empires. His father, who was the most ruthless and successful speculator in the history of Wall Street to that point in time, and arguably to this day, since Bernie Madoff was caught, his father never believed in any such things like democracy or humane living standards for the peoples of the third world for a second, but John Kennedy did. John Kennedy did. The same way we look at Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli, in his 40s and 50s, is a voice for social justice. He does not have an economic brain in his head. He was notoriously in debt for most of his life, because he always lived outside his means. Churchill, incidentally, was exactly the same way. But Disraeli had a good heart, and Disraeli was always privately despised and distrusted by Robert Gascoigne Salisbury. And it is only after the convenient death of Disraeli that several things happen. First, another president of the United States is assassinated, the assassination of 1881 that we discussed before. And secondly, the Anarchist Congress is held in London, and what the Anarchist Congress does, it establishes a template for murder. And the template that it establishes is the opposite of the myth that the Anarchist International enjoys to this day, aided and abetted by that amazing idiot Barbara Tuchman. It is the pick up the proud tower. Kropotkin is presented as a sweet, lovable, kindly, gentle saint who makes Gandhi look like a fascist tyrant by contrast, right? That's the way she presents him. The anarchist movement is presented as the opposite of what it was. A cry of the oppressed misery of the masses. No. Who were the victims of the anarchist movement for the next 20 years? It is consistent. It is always the leaders who have done the most to raise the living standards of the masses. And Kropotkin, like psychotic evil murderers of his ilk, even has an ideological justification for this. He says these are the very people you have to kill because they give the evil capitalist system a good name. And therefore, it is the very people who make the capitalist system look as if it's actually increasing the living standards of ordinary people, who make industrial civilization look like it is worthwhile, which of course in reality it is. These are the people you have to kill. These are the people you have to kill. It turns reality on its head. And this kind of argument does not convince many people, but it will convince idiots like Sophia Andreevna in the Tchaikovsky Circle in 1872. And it will convince absurd red Emma Goldman. both of them very ugly ladies who are being claimed in history to be attractive, and they are not. And this is extremely important too, because Kropotkin was a darkly handsome young man, and in his old age, in middle age, he puts on weight and he looks like Santa Claus. And this is the perfect, there is actually a great novel written about this by a most improbable person. H.G. Wells' ex-lover, who hated him like poison, Dame Rebecca West, wrote the one great novel about Russian revolutionaries ever to be written by a non-Russian. Well, actually, no, that's not fair, by a non-Slav, because Joseph Conrad wrote The Secret Agent. Conrad's magnificent. Polish. Writes in English the way no Englishman can dream of writing. A genius. That's Conrad. But so is Dame Rebecca. The birds fall down. I cannot recommend it highly enough to this audience and to anyone else reading it. It came out about 60 years ago. It is full of both wisdom and wit. It's not directly about Kropotkin, but the central figure in the novel, the central villain in the novel, is very much a Kropotkin figure, a man who appears to be a saint, a man who is beloved by all for his kindness and generousness, except, of course, for his implacable hatred for all enemies of the revolution and his diabolical skill at torture and betrayal and inflicting human suffering and murder. And it takes 400 to 500 pages for the main protagonists in the novel to work this out. The novel is also extraordinary for being written by a lady who, one of the central characters in the novel is an eminent Russian reactionary aristocrat, the former Tsarist Minister of Justice, a fictional character she creates for the novel, but he is written with total sympathy. Dame Rebecca, remember, this is the woman who early on had been a lover of H.G. Wells. She had a son by him, and her son becomes an eminent novelist himself, Anthony West. The family is fascinating. Anthony West loves his father, H.G., hates his mother. She thrives on his hatred. They have a venomous, hate-filled relationship for 60 years until she dies in her late 80s. She was, as my father would have said, a tough bit of stuff, a tough old lady, right? But she hates H.G. Wells and she sees through him. And much of her later work can be seen as an answer to Wells. Now, Rebecca West is an astonishing figure. She starts out as a liberal figure in Hampstead revolutionary circles and pro-H.G. Wells and pro-liberalism and in enlightened birth control and in favor of the elite and Bertrand Russell and everything like this in the early 1920s. She travels through Serbia and the Balkans and writes one of the most sympathetic and insightful works on Serbia and on Slavic civilization and historical suffering in the Balkans that has ever been written. She is a British patriot and intelligence officer against the Nazis in World War II. She writes the climate of treason after World War II, when she is bitterly opposed to the communist traitors in the British Secret Service. And she lives to become a reactionary, looking at the Beatles and the permissive revolution in Britain, which are not remotely as permissive as she had been 40 and 50 years earlier, of course, but she looks on them in horror and becomes an arch reactionary in the 1960s and 70s. And then, of course, she is taken up by Margaret Thatcher. This enthusiast for the most improbable of causes. If I may finish here, Mrs. Thatcher wanted to make my old teacher, Isaiah Berlin, a member of the House of Lords. This created immense embarrassment for Isaiah because he was, although he revered the Queen personally, he was English Republican at heart. He always felt, nobody ever attacked him for it. They revered him for accepting a knighthood, but he felt guilty for it for his own life, so he was determined never to go into the House of Lords. First point. But secondly, he hated Mrs. Thatcher, and she loved him. And he has enough street smarts to know that when you're up against a British 3 times elected prime minister with all the energy and intelligence and willpower of Margaret Thatcher, you do not cross her lightly, you do not cross her at all. So the correspondence between them should still make a comic minor movie masterpiece someday. Because here is Thatcher spilling out her passion for Berlin, because she does have the brains to appreciate ideas, whether you agree with her or disagree with her. And she loves Berlin's basic ideas. But Berlin hates her because he's a man of the left. He's a social democrat. And she's, of course, a Van Hayek, minimum government libertarian. She believes the big fish should have the freedom to eat the little fish, and he does not. But as I say, backtracking here a little as we close, Rebecca West is a wonderful postscript to this, because you understand the psychology of the anarchists and the Kropotkin people here, because she's not talking about the communist revolutionary movement. She is talking about the social revolutionaries who are the Russian heirs of Kropotkin, who specialize in killing the Russian aristocracy. And in this novel of her maturity, Rebecca West simply says, they are murdering people. This is monstrous. And there is one scene towards the end of the novel where the heroine, Laura, a supposedly innocent, though really far from innocent, 16-year-old beautiful English girl, who was really Dame Rebecca looking back in time. And like, probably it was Rebecca West herself who would have been formidable at age 16, both beautiful and brilliant at the same time, and unrepressed at the time when everybody else was repressed in English society. That's a knockout combination. That is really a knockout combination, right? She has her 16-year-old character is talking with the arch villain. And of course, as in all great novels and comic masterpieces, they're talking at cross purposes to each other. Laura already realizes she's dealing with a monster, a mass murderer who has destroyed her family's happiness and life. And she realizes this. She doesn't realize he has the hots for her. He is lusting after her. He thinks she is an innocent, brainless, sweet, harmless, childish little thing who needs to be protected in her purity and innocence. And he's a mass murderer. And this is his fantasy. And they're in a hotel in Belgium at a seaside resort, and a couple come into the hotel room. It's just a young guy and his girlfriend, and they want to be intimate with each other, and they don't realize that there are already people in the room. And the revolutionary guy is outraged. How dare you get on like this here? There is a pure, innocent, young English aristocratic lady here. Get out of this room immediately. I will protect you, Miss Laura. And then Rebecca West, you're ahead of this, Matt, in second. So are you, Jerry, or have you read it already? There is this wonderful line when we shift to Laura's instinct. And Laura is thinking, Laura felt no hatred or fear or shock or animosity at that young couple. They were just gratifying their own needs, their own passions. Maybe they were in love with each other, maybe not, but they were harmless. They had not read dangerous books that told them to go out and murder people. Now, West is writing 50 years after the Russian Revolution and the hecatombs of dead that Lenin and Stalin created. And she probably did not see this at the time when she herself was a 16-year-old girl. But looking back from the 1960s, this former mistress of H.G. Wells, who bore his son and became the bitterest of enemies to both her ex-lover and her own son, for which we should admire and respect her, if not for anything else. And actually, there's a lot, I think, to admire and respect her for. This is what she comes back to. This is what she comes back to. And incidentally, I also recommend there's a wonderful paperback out there, if you can get it for less than $1,000, which you may not be able to, Rebecca West, A Celebration, which contains not only The Birds Fall Down, but a lot of her outstanding journalism and historical work and fiction over an extraordinary 60-year literary career. But as I say, we finish here till next week. Next week, I hope to continue with a forensic examination of the two great defining murders, the bookends of the age of assassination. The first is the murder of the Tsar in 1881. The second is the murder of President McKinley in 1901. A year or 2 years ago, I had done no significant work on either of these things. It was the work of you, Matt, and of Cynthia, and very much of Anton, the three of you, that brought me into this, because I realized you had established the broad picture, the crucial historical revision. You had smashed the Macaulay paradigm that I was working in. So, and I finish with a very crucial point here. Hopefully we'll have time for questions, but it's this. Soft power, intellectual power is very misunderstood. And they want you to misunderstand it. The myth of soft power is our ideas are superior to everyone else. The BBC and Voice of America and all our Canadian equivalents, of course, these are the most free, the most perfect, the most virtuous, the most transparent sources of information the human race has ever known. So trust us, and you will get everything you need from us. And once you swallow that central lie, everything else follows. But the secondly, that's the soft power directly. But soft power is not in isolation the way we've been taught it to be. Soft power is a precursor to hard power. Soft power, first of all, prepares the way for revolutions, from the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution, to the failed revolution in Kazakhstan we have just seen, to the repeated attempts to topple the democratic regime, elected governments in Venezuela and throughout Latin America. Soft power is used to prepare the way for hard power. And secondly, soft power is used to cover the facts of assassination and murder after the event. If you believe that President Juarez of Mexico died of a convenient heart attack, and it was an act of God, and you then see Mexico is plunged into a dark age worse than that of Joseph Stalin under General Porfirio Diaz, enormously supported by the financial interests of Paris and London, and latterly by the bankers of New York City as well. Well, that's a very different way to view the history of the world, isn't it? And if you believe that the great Tsar of Russia is killed by his own people, and one further point I will add here, the role of his own Ochrana, of his own secret police, in letting the assassination happen, and then being so efficient that they prevent any more czars being assassinated until the whole regime has been destroyed by World War I. It's like the Kennedy assassination. The Kennedy assassination and the assassination of Alexander II are only possible when the deep state itself wants an anomalous ruler gone. When they have decided that the anomalous ruler is a threat to the very existential system that they are the central core of, then the assassination, as Colonel Fletcher now said in the 1960s, can be allowed to take place naturally once the bubble of protection around the victim is removed. A very observant individual, one of the greatest and wisest leaders in American history, who I've already tried to do credit for through your wonderful seminars, saw this. Former President of the United States, former General of the Armies of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. President Grant visits St. Petersburg in 1879, 2 years before the assassination. What is his opinion of the Tsar? Now, you must remember, this is a man who is regarded by liberals as a boor, although really has a dry Midwest sense of humor. When he visits Venice, he's asked what he thinks of Venice, the most beautiful city in the world. I very much hold that view. We were there on a honeymoon, and since. Is it the most beautiful city in the world? I think definitely. What does Grant say about it? Wouldn't be a bad place if you drained the streets. Now, of course, actually, he's joking. And none of the liberal idiots think that a guy who didn't go to college and, came from a family of saddle makers and leather makers in the Midwest is capable of intelligence, is capable of humor. But of course, Grant is. Grant wins the respect and admiration of Otto von Bismarck, the Tsar of all the Russias, the Meiji Emperor of Japan, who gives him the highest decoration ever given in the history of Japan to a non-Japanese on his visit to Japan, and even of Queen Victoria. And Disraeli, incidentally, is very impressed by him. Gladstone, not so, interestingly enough. Grant visits the Tsar, and he has already met President McMahon in France. He has already met the Queen Victoria and the Prime Minister of England. By this point, and the Tsar and the Kaiser of Germany, and Bismarck, and Moltke, all of whom are in awe of his military achievements, and rightly so. And what is his assessment of the Tsar? He says afterwards, the Tsar did not strike me as a happy man or a man at peace. He was a man who knew he was being hunted to his death. And he was. I will add one final point here, which really belongs next week, but it should be, I will answer this next week, but you rightly said, you taught me, Matt, I ought to be a showman, and I am a showman. So here's another hook for next week. Why did Peter Kropotkin hate the Tsar of Russia? The best, the most courageous and admirable ruler Russia ever had. The man who played a central role in protecting the freed slaves of America and preserving the American Union from destruction. Why did the saintly Peter Kropotkin hate Alexander so much? There are 3 answers to this question, and I'll give them all next week. And every one of them should come as a surprise to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty.
Oh, bless you, Stephen. Yay. Thank you.
Cynthia's very happy.
Now, I realize everyone probably needs to go off now, but having said that, I am, if you think there's time for it, Matt, I am free to hand it over.
Yeah. Look, I have personally an open night. I've got 30 minutes. Well, open. I've got 30 minutes, and I have one thought I want to share. I know Quan and Stephen both got in with a desire to toss out a question, and I think John has a question too. So we have 3 questions. So if we can do that in 30 minutes, maybe 35, do you think you can do that in 35 minutes, Marty?
The questions?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
All right. Okay.
You know me. Rein me in when I go too long, because you all know, Renna, I know you know this. I always go too long. So rein me, just stop me when I do.
No, Marty, your creative flow is great. I would feel terrible trying to rein that in. Okay, so here, my thought that just entered my mind listening to you speak was just, and this isn't so much a question, but rather one, Disraeli is somebody who I always found to be totally anomalous as far as British aristocracy was concerned. And I really appreciate what you did, because when I heard his excerpt talking about, almost in a sad tone, is how I read it, talking about the different kings from George I and II who tried not to be Venetian doges. Or no, they were Venetian doges. And then he said George III tried not to be, but he couldn't break from his from his constitution. I thought that was just always something that struck me, like so candid, to be able to identify that, as far as linking a continuity between the structures of Venice and then the takeover after William of Orange. I thought that was really interesting that somebody like Disraeli would say that. So I just want to throw that out there for you. And number 2, every time throughout your entire presentation, the parallel between today's, I've got a book, we have a book called Londonistan.
Yeah,
going through the British liberal.
Is that written by Melanie Phillips?
I forget. I'm bad with author names sometimes, but it's
Look
a great
up
book.
This is a lady. If it's by Melanie, we knew each other very well in Oxford. We loathed each other even then, because I was an arch conservative and she was an arch liberal. And today, of course, our roles are exactly reversed, and we still loathe each other.
Yeah, it was that's right, Melanie Phillips. That's correct. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. And that's interesting that you knew her. I had no idea. But the fact that Britain has
Melanie hates Muslims and Arabs. She hates them with just as the way she despises the Irish.
It's unfortunate, but what I got out of it, what I appreciated was the fact that Britain has been the hub, providing headquarters and basing inside of the heart of to all of these various international terrorist cells. And you've had like Egyptian, Libyan, Iraqi governments petitioning the British government to say, please shut down the terrorist headquarters that you're providing safe haven with. And Britain would always say, oh no, we can't judge. We're just here, we're liberal. And the parallels to the terrorist, or the anarchist terrorist process of the 19th century is just so strong in my mind. And I would like, maybe if you want to comment on that.
Oh, Matt, perfect. Again, you'll have to rein me in because there's so much I could say. First, you're 100% correct. Secondly, it was this very understanding of the dynamics that led me backwards to understand, I did not look at the pioneering events of the 19th century, the British Empire's protection of the Anarchist International, and then apply it to the 20th century or the 21st century. It was in reverse. I looked at what happened in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and to this day, and applied that backwards. The Saudis protected the PLO in the 60s and 70s. It did not matter how outrageous the kidnapping, murder, and torture of Israeli children or Israeli athletes in the Munich Olympic Games was, the Saudis didn't care. But in the 21st century, once Osama bin Laden and his people, they did not care about 9/11. They did not care about 3,000 American dead. They did not raise a finger to protect the United States because they knew the Bush family and American petrodollar interests were so heavily compromised with them correctly, the US would never dare to move against them. They knew all of this, right? But, and this is all in my 2008 book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Middle East, written incidentally when I was much more conservative and conventional in many respects than I am now. But much of this, I would say, stands the test of time. And I have written about this at length, and I was the first significant American correspondent to write on this in books and in analysis for UPenn. And needless to say, no good turn ever goes unpunished. I never got any professional recognition for any of this. But in 2003 and 4, I'm already pointing out in my outlets that the Saudis woke up to the threat that bin Laden and al-Qaeda faced only when it was turned on them, when al-Qaeda in Arabia was created as a direct attempt to reestablish the caliphate by toppling the Saudi monarchy and seizing control of Mecca, Medina, and the greatest oil fields. The Saudi response to that under King Abdullah was decisive. They did things which little Americans sneer at and turn up their nose at. We are always told that suppression of terrorism does not work. We are always told that decapitation of terrorist leaders does not work. Only other terrorist leaders, much more formidable than the first one, will come up. It is a lie. It is an idiocy. It is a stupidity. It is perfectly true that if you kill a formidable terrorist leader, you may get a worse one in his place. But if you kill that leader too, who comes after him? And if you kill that leader, who comes after him? The Saudis decapitated al-Qaeda in Arabia 8 times in 3 years, and they kept on doing it. And as a result, there was almost no al-Qaeda left there. That is the first point. Secondly, as I have also pointed out in other articles, and in my book in 2008, the psychological and socioeconomic profiles of the attackers on 9/11 and of the key leaders of al-Qaeda fit exactly the profiles, as I belatedly discovered in the last 3 years, of the Narodny Avolia in Russia, of the people's will. These people did not come from the starving, supposedly oppressed working classes. These people from Pakistan through Arabia, through the Palestinians, and Iraq, and there are many generations of hundreds of thousands, even millions of Pakistani immigrants who came to Britain and hugely built up the British economy and state and revered the Queen and revered all the values that they're taught to, and who behave like English football hooligans, which they are, as well as anybody who was, whose family goes back there 1,000 years to us. All of the above. All of the above. No. In both cases, we are talking about tiny groups of misplaced, deracinated intellectuals who are cut off from their own roots, who are cut off from their own culture, who become easy prey to be manipulated by the puppet masters. And you only need a dozen or so people in each case, but what you have behind them is something they themselves are not aware of. The vast deep state network that protects them from conventional law enforcement people, that protects them until they can carry out their infamous crimes. And this protection was given by the Okhrana to the Narodny Avolia in the assassination of the great Tsar. In America in 1901 is a different story. There is no national police force. There is actually a case. I mean, of course, there is a theoretical case to be made. There isn't even a secret service till the assassination of President McKinley. Or rather, there is a secret service, but it just works with counterfeiting. It isn't even tasked with protecting the president till after McKinley, President McKinley is shot dead by Leon Czolgosz. Incidentally, since you had a Russian aristocrat, Kropotkin, behind both murders, he chooses as his instrument of murder in both cases the lowest form of humanity he can imagine, a Polish working class man. In both cases, Grabinski in throwing the grenade against the Tsar, and Czolgosz, who has personally had I mean, after an experience like this, public execution may have been a relief to Czolgosz after he had the romantic attentions of Emma Goldman, a terrifying experience, I would assume, for any normal human being. But he had been, and it worked for him. And we shall see more next week. Goldman, who claims she never knew the man, nevertheless talks about him as an exceptionally sensitive soul. When he fired that bullet at point blank range into the defenseless body of the peace-loving president of the United States. I have different views on the kind of person that are sensitive souls. I think all of us here would. But on the London stand thing, deeply, my own, and again, I find myself, I'm sure many of you have found this too, that in your maturity, many of the ideas, the principles you fight for, you appreciate, that you think are new to you, when you look back in your childhood or your teenage years or your impressionable years, you find they're already prefigured there. You have experiences, you have teachers, there was something you read or saw on television that called out to you at the time and you didn't know why, and you forget about it for 10 or 20 or 30 years, and then the wheel comes full circle and the idea comes to life, or you say, my God, that's it. My teacher, and I've written a memoir about this man, Professor Elie Kaduri, along with Isaiah Berlin, the other great defining intellectual influence on me in my undergrad and postgraduate years at Oxford and London School of Economics. There is a book I recommend to you, the Chatham House version. Kaduri, who was an Iraqi Jew, whose own father was hanged by an Arab nationalist government for a crime of which he was innocent, and the British ruling powers in Iraq permitted it to happen for selfish, expedient political interests, a fact that he kept hidden for the rest of his life for more than half a century, for nearly 60 years afterwards. Kaduri takes on and defies Chatham House and Arnold Toynbee. He takes over the defining myth of the 20th century that of Lawrence of Arabia, that the English are the friends of the Arabs, the protectors of the Arabs. The Arabs cannot look after themselves. The Arabs cannot rule themselves. The Arabs are not capable of ruling themselves. But don't worry, we, your kindly English overlords, in return for such homosexual favors, which are very deeply forbidden at home publicly, we will provide you with these resources. T.E. Lawrence, of course, is a classic example of all these phobias and screw-ups. And he was not a lover, but he was an intimate friend also of Winston Churchill. He was Churchill's chief advisor at the Cairo Conference in 1921, which created the nations from scratch of Palestine, which becomes Israel, of Jordan today, and of Iraq under a Hashemite monarchy, when nobody in Iraq wants the Hashemites. And the British imposed the Hashemites in Iraq for nearly 40 years. And when the Iraqi people have their say, they exterminate the entire Hashemite family. Exterminate them because they have hated them for 37 years. Democracy never came into it. Fake democracy came into it. But here is the Chatham House version, which is that Arab nationalism grew from the desert, grew from T.E. Lawrence's revolt. These ignorant forces, the British were really true lovers and best friends of the Arabs, best protectors the Arabs ever had. These are all cynical myths which the British developed to keep the French out of the Middle East. They had no conception of any communist threat at the time. They thought they were manipulating the Jews as well. Again, one walks into the future when one is young. For those of you who are young here, I'm not saying because the very fact that you're here means that you're courageous and you're principled and you will walk into controversy and fight, and I'm sure you've already done so. But just be aware that dignify them more than you probably do. Don't be too modest. These will have repercussions for you, and good repercussions, not bad. In 1979, Menachem Begin's office put me on the blacklist and tried to get me fired from the Jerusalem Post because of a disrespectful article I wrote for him in the Jerusalem Post, which in those days was a democratic, somewhat left of center, still strongly Zionist, but very different kind of Zionist, Ben Gurion tradition newspaper, as opposed to the Likud supporting ultra right-wing newspaper it has been for the last 30 years. And I was very young, and I didn't realize what I was stumbling into. I was taught by a professor who hated Chatham House and the establishment of the British Empire and the lies that they had woven to try and keep British control of the Middle East. And he had a passion for scholarship and the truth, in contrast to his contemporary, that contemptible phony Bernard Lewis. And I did a demolition job on Bernard Lewis. If any of you have not seen it, contact me and I'll send you a copy of it. I also did one, metaphorically at least, jumping on Charlie Krauthammer's grave a few years ago. Krauthammer, like Melanie Phillips, I first met at Oxford. And unlike Melanie, I liked Krauthammer in those days. I think that was just me being young and naive and stupid and superficial. But I think Krauthammer was always a vain, superficial, overrated, contemptible, ludicrous jerk who would have been entertaining if he hadn't done so much demolition and harm, which of course he did over the years. He has justified every American aggression in the world in general, and especially against the Arab Muslim peoples of the Middle East over the last 30 or 40 years. Now, do the anarchists seek the power of the state for themselves? Well, Kropotkin did, yes. But most of them believe in the nonsense. They simply drink the Kool-Aid. They drink the Kool-Aid. It's as simple as that. But if you look at Kropotkin and you look at the treatment of the character who is loosely based on Kropotkin, I didn't realize it at the time, in Rebecca West's great novel, The Birds Fall Down, they both live comfortable lives. They are not aesthetics. Very often leaders with a reputation for being aesthetics are not aesthetics at all. David Ben Gurion, it was said that he lived very simply. And he did. He was, I mean, I've seen where he lived. But at the same time, he had a longing for books. And that was his one indulgence, to be fair to Ben Gurion. But Gandhi, it was rightly said of Gandhi that for Gandhi, and George Orwell, among others, says it, that for Gandhi to live as an aesthetic was more expensive than for half a dozen millionaires to live in luxury. And there is a great deal of truth to that. One point, right on, Quan, I agree with you completely, man. One point I'll add is, the older I get, the more I appreciate Martin Luther King and President Mandela. Because when Mandela is given power, although he has every reason to hate and destroy, the more power he gets, the more restrained and wise and forgiving and understanding he is in wielding it. Gandhi was not like that. In 1946, Gandhi says it is a tragedy the nuclear bomb was developed so late, because had it been developed earlier, we could have used it against the English. And he meant it. He was not joking. In 1942, here is Gandhi's contribution to the war effort against Imperial Japan, a nation that had carried out wars of genocide and extermination against the people of China over the previous 5 years. This is 5 years after the massacre of 750,000 people in the Yangtze Valley and the rape of Nanjing. Gandhi calls on remember, he's a Hindu. He calls on the Muslim peoples of India to rise up in holy war, in jihad, to exterminate the English. What is the response of the Muslim peoples who have now been demonized in Pakistan to this? They rally to the English flag because it isn't the English they fear. They know the English are finally going to quit the subcontinent. It is Gandhi's endless rallies in which 50,000 innocent Muslims were killed in communal riots in the 1920s and 1930s. This is what the Muslims of the subcontinent are afraid of. When I wrote this in my 2008 book, my book and I magically became persona non grata in India to this day. To this day. History has its curveballs. Usually the heroes turn out to be vastly more heroic and admirable than you even imagined, but very often they're very unexpected heroes. And the people who you thought were heroes, not always, but sometimes, turn out to be the absolute jerks. Doug, if you may not be there, but thank you. That's a lovely message, and I very much appreciate it. I hope you get that at least in response. Robin, thank you again. James, thank you. I'd forgotten Garfield's name. And again, a very crucial point you raised. We see with President Harding as well as with Garfield, they had not been there in power long, but they were already posing threat. Look, a guy I worked for, a rather creepy man at UPI, but in his own way, a brilliant guy, had great insight. Cambridge educated, in fact, again. He once said to me about Stalin, the most terrifying and brilliant thing about Stalin was he knew who his enemies were going to be from his understanding of human nature 10 to 20 years before they knew it themselves, which meant he could take his time and exterminate his future enemies while they were still his friends, before they'd done anything against him, because he understood from their principles, from their policies, what they would do when he eventually felt it was necessary to cross them. He was a psychopath, of course. Best book on Stalin, two of them, are written by Simon Sebag Montefiore, wonderful English Jewish historian. I had studied the monster for 50 years before I read Simon's books, and then I realized it was as if I was approaching him for the first time. And they're beautifully written and darkly, wittily funny too. One is The Court of the Red Tsar, and the other one is Young Stalin, which is written later, but starts with Young Stalin. Now, I'm sorry, next question. I mean, I varied off it, but I hope I've answered your question, Matt.
Oh, you added so much more. That adds so much more. It was good.
But you're right again. Chatham House and the English Romantic Arabists are at the center of this, and they're not true friends of the Arab peoples at all. They have the most demeaning and contemptible attitudes towards them. But the other point is, they have learned the lesson of their ancestors, which other people have also learned, which the Soviets also learned, which is to protect yourself against international terrorists, protect them. And the deal you make is, we will protect you as long as you don't go after any of our people.
Right.
There was one Palestinian group in 1978-70 who made the mistake of kidnapping and murdering a perfectly harmless Russian diplomat in Beirut. This is not politically fashionable for either left or right to remember today, but the Russian response was immediate, although they had supported and afterwards continued to support the PLO and other groups through thick and thin. And the PLO quite very wisely cooperated with the Russians in this. They helped the Russians find the individuals responsible, and they were castrated while still alive, and then their bodies while still alive were further hideously carved up, and then the bodies were left to be found. And guess what? There were no more terrorist attacks against Russian diplomats. They knew who and what they were dealing with. A very Roman approach to the problem. And of course, Russia was the third Rome. So, you know, I jumped from one connection to another. But hopefully it's time for one or two more questions before I have to go, or before you have to go.
Well, I hope so too. I know Quan's been waiting for a long time.
Oh, please, Quan, go ahead.
And then Stephen. So Quan, Stephen, and hopefully John, we can squeeze into.
Hi, Martin. Thanks for enlightening us. I think you answered in part to my question, because I was hoping that you would offer us a kind of typology of the useful idiots. But I think that you gave the root answer.
It would be endless, Quan, but it's so long.
But go on, I think I think you gave us the root answer by saying that most of the time they are people who have been cut from their traditional roots and their own classical culture, either born in a poor family or born in the aristocracy, like Prince Kropotkin.
Oh, bless you for that, because let us go back to Kropotkin. Kropotkin was not just an aristocrat. He believed he was superior to the Tsar. He believed, and it's probably a lie, but it has been swallowed uncritically by his admirers for the last 150 years, that he was a descendant of the House of Rurik, the original rulers of Russia. Now, the House of Rurik died out in the Dark Ages, even long before the time of Ivan the Terrible, even Grozny. But this shows you what his pretensions were. He believed he was superior to the Tsar. He had also been a page to the Tsar. As a young boy, he was a page to the man he grew to hate, Alexander II. We will go into more of this next week, because this is where Dr. Freud will help us enormously. These are very dark and twisted waters. Why was the most tolerant of Tsars the man who liberated the Jews from their own dark ages and dark age rabbis, forces as dark as the Spanish Inquisition, and the Tsar liberated from this. The Tsar was loved by the Jews, he was loved by Ukrainians, he was loved by the peasants he liberated. So where did the hatred for him come from? Only from a tiny number of people, from the deep state and from Kropotkin personally. And Kropotkin passes on to Sieff Andreevna. But Kropotkin all his life is living multiple lies. He is pretending to be a kind, gentle saint, and he loves being revered as a saint. He loves fooling idiot English working man who he has a pint of beer with, and being one of the lads. And of course, he is comfortably protected and leads an upper middle class existence in the most advanced and sophisticated city of the time in the world, London, under Queen Victoria, all this time of his life. So he's living a lie. He's living multiple levels of lies. Multiple levels of lies. And at the same time, what is the reality of the movement that he is leading? And this, again, I cannot emphasize strongly enough. At its outer edges, the anarchist movement, like so many of us here follow serious or have followed different professors or academics or serious intellectual leaders who are brilliant and have had great insight. And there are other, especially religious pseudo-type and revolutionary crackpots in the world, of which, of course, I maintain Kropotkin is a classic example. When you're on the fringe of these people, it can look attractive. But as with even the way the Freemasons, who appear to be entirely respectable, at least up to the 33rd grade or what have you, beyond that, who knows? And beyond that would be probably something, I've known several 33 third level Masons in my life, and they all seem to be admirable human beings. And if you look at their own track record, they are. But then again, there's wheels within wheels. Who knows what, right? But when you're looking at the Kropotkin and people like that, the further you get into the anarchist movement, the more you find it is the opposite of what it appears to be and what useful idiots like Tuchman make it out to be. Now, Tuchman, as I say, is a very important useful idiot because she has misled the whole world on this for 60 years. And it's worth mentioning here, I was going to do it next week, but it really won't here. What else does she mislead the world on? First of all, I mentioned her book Stillwell on the American Experience in China. It's an extraordinarily stupid and endlessly long and incoherent book. She makes Stillwell out to be a saint, a genius, dedicated to the well-being of the Chinese people, when he is actually an ugly, stupid, reductionist racist who bungles the only combat command he is later given. He's given command in Iwo Jima, a thankless command, after the previous commanding general there, Simon Bolivar Buckner, is stupid enough to stand up wearing a 3-star helmet and then gets shot. He's the highest ranking American soldier to be killed by enemy action in World War II. So Stillwell, who has come back from China, he's a political appointment of FDR. He has been given 4 stars. And all he has done is wreck the Chinese-US alliance and wreck any significant support for the Chiang Kai-shek government, which is certainly ugly, but he makes no effort to understand it or work with it whatsoever. He's a classic, arrogant, stupid, ignorant American proconsul. And Tuchman is stupid enough to take him at face value. And take a read of the book myself, don't take my word of it. Tuchman and the American Experience in China. Then she writes, and she wins a Pulitzer Prize for it. She also wins a Pulitzer Prize for The Guns of August, which is based on the Oxford historian A.J.P. Taylor, another full of himself, stupid little ignorant shit, incompetent shit, whose lectures I actually sat in because he was a world famous reputation at the time, and I was curious. And I was almost as arrogant then as I am now. I was ready to judge these people. And I didn't have enough to realize that A.J.P. Taylor really was an asshole. But he certainly seemed so to me. 30 years after I sat in with lectures with him, I had a friend, I think he's still alive in Cleveland today, brilliant, extraordinary man, one of the two outstanding American military theoreticians of the past 40, 50 years, since John Boyd. And his name is William Lind. I think it's S. Lind, L-I-N-D. William Lind, who improbably enough was a military advisor, a very thankless job for many years, to Senator Gary Hart, of which he had many fun tales to tell. But it was from Bill Lind that I learned this background. It is crucial. A.J.P. Taylor writes in a book about the origins of World War I in the 1960s. And Barbara Tuchman takes this from him. And so does President Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis, that Britain sent a memorandum, an ultimatum to the Kaiser, which it did, saying, we will not intervene in your war against Russia and against France. Britain will stay out of the war. It will stay neutral, provided you do not invade Belgium on the way, because we regard Belgium's ports as a strategic threat to the survival of Britain. And if they fall into German hands with your own fleet and your superlative army, we will be continually a threat from you. Existentially, they saw German occupation of the Belgian ports the same way we saw the Soviet placement of missiles in Cuba. That's the way they really saw it. The Kaiser, and this is all correct history so far, was delighted at this message, summons the nephew of the great Moltke, the second Moltke, a repulsive and quite clinically insane idiot. We can get to that in due course on another occasion. And says to him, look, isn't this wonderful? Change the direction of the armies. All we have to do is not attack Belgium, and we can knock out France at our leisure, and the British will let us do it. All this is accurate history. All this is true. All this is completely correct. Now we come to where first A.J.P. Taylor and then following him, Tuchman screwed it up. The Kaiser, the General Field Marshal von Moltke, has a nervous breakdown on the spot. But all highest, he says to the Kaiser, we cannot do this. It will be the destruction of Germany because the reign timetables are set in iron and we cannot change them. We have to go through to Belgium to knock out France and win the war. Doesn't matter if we bring in the British Empire against us. And then to make his point, Moltke quite literally melts down. He collapses at the feet of the Kaiser, foams at the mouth, and starts biting the Kaiser's boots. The Kaiser is wearing high boots, so there's a lot of leather. They're very kinky, right? Now you see why this never gets in any of the conventional histories. And all this is true. So the Kaiser listens to the chief of the German general staff, supposedly the most experienced, wisest military commander in the world. And what does he do? And this really does happen. He says, okay, damn it, we'll have to go through Belgium and knock out the French, even if the British come in. What can they do? And as a result, the war lasts 4 years instead of 6 months. And we all know what happens everywhere, right? Now, all that is completely true, except Tuchman and the Kaiser. That incident happened exactly as described, but Tuchman and A.J.P. Taylor never dug deeper, which William S. Lind did, because the German General Staff was the most thorough and professional military organization in the world at the time. And they drew up contingency plans for everything. And they had indeed drawn up contingency military timetables to change the axis of the Schlieffen Plan and the attack on the western flank to knock out France, so that they could have done it without going through Belgium and just had gone through France instead. And it would have worked because there was no Maginot Line in the time. And the French, under their idiot generals in 1914, weren't digging down. They actually charged openly, thinking it was the glory and Napoleonic way to do it. And it was a Napoleonic way to do it because modern machine guns and heavy artillery and even fast reloading rifles had not been invented a century before in Napoleon's time. Right? So, in other words, all the Kaiser or his own top general needed to do was pick up a telephone. And if they had picked up a telephone, they could have called their own general staff office and said, do we have a plan to invade France? Can we switch the mobilization of the armies with the railroads so we can attack France without going through Belgium? We'll get back to you on that, all highest. We'll get back to you, Herr Field Marshal. And because they're German and efficient and well run, within an hour and probably less, they would have done so and said, sure, yeah, we can. Give us the order and we'll do it, all highest. Simple. Peace with Britain. War is won. In other words, the Emperor of Germany and his top, the most famous general in the world, were too stupid to either remember their own war plan or to pick up a telephone and check whether the war plan was there or not. That is the real lesson of 1914. And A.J.P. Taylor was too stupid and lousy a historian to dig it out, and was too fond of a quick moralistic answer to everything. You know, I say it, and I'm a little lad from Lancashire, and I'm the most brilliant historian who ever lived. He was like this. He was a ridiculous little shit, and he jumped up and down all the time. And that's the way he fucking well was. I sat in his lectures. I knew the guy. I faced him face to face. He was a little creep, you know. Now, Vladimir Putin is a small guy, but him face to face too. This is not a man you disrespect, nor is Margaret Thatcher. They're both physically small people, but the intelligence, the intellect, the force of personality, in each case, these are not people you want to cross. These are people you, if you have any brains at all in your head, you will treat with respect. Otherwise, yet Barbara Tuchman's own documented stupidity saved the world. Because President Kennedy, God help us, the nearest thing to a real intellectual, and he was, as was his wife, Jackie for that matter. I've talked with people who talked with them both. Isaiah Berlin had a very interesting take on Kennedy. He didn't like him personally, but he was impressed by him. He said, I felt I was meeting Alexander the Great. The youth, the brilliance, the confidence, the determination to move worlds. He was in full sympathy with Kennedy's political aims, but he also saw the political and intellectual power in Kennedy. That's the crucial point that Berlin saw. And of course, he hadn't seen that in the President of the United States since Franklin Roosevelt. And after Kennedy's assassination, Berlin lives another 34 years, but he loses interest in future American presidents. After you've met Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy, everyone is, he never said it in those words, but it's very clear. From Berlin's perspective, every future president of the United States and ruler of the imperium is an anticlimax after you've met Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy, right? But again, back in 1914. This is extraordinary. And it has another bearing on Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy does not trust his generals. He does not trust Curtis LeMay. None of us would be here alive today if he had. When you find political leaders, and usually Democrat liberals who have no military background are much more prone to trust their military commanders. And the best presidents at preserving the peace are people who've been combat leaders or military professionals themselves, like Eisenhower, President Zachary, as opposed to Maxwell Taylor. For that matter, the first President Bush, who had not been a general, but had seen real combat in World War II. And he was a dangerous, incredibly ruthless son of a bitch. But he was a brilliant man. His problem was he hit it too well. Everybody thought he was the harmless twit he tried to appear. He was too successful. I saw Bush in action. And I never even saw Weenie Behind the Masks, but I saw enough to see there was a profound, serious, highly intelligent, forceful individual there who was not the slightly effeminate East Coast preppy from a sheltered background that he so successfully appeared to be in public. He was too good at his own cover. He was too good at his own cover. There you are. That's another story. But in 1914, there's another enormous miscalculation. Winston Churchill is the political head of the Royal Navy, First Lord of the Admiralty in the British Empire. He is the most hands-on operational political chief the Royal Navy has ever had or will ever have. He loves the technicalities of war. He has modernized the Navy. He has given it the most advanced battleships in the world. And because he has given it the most advanced battleships in the world, he has made previous British strategy obsolete. Churchill has moved the battle fleet of Britain from the East Coast, where it had been for the previous 400 years, up to the north of Scotland, Scapa Flow, island in the Hebrides. Hell of a place. Nobody wanted to go there, but Churchill said, you go. And strategically, it proved such an ideal position to command the oceans in World War I that 30 years later, the British Navy kept the Germans bottled in a Second World War for another 6 years, again at Scapa Flow in 1939 to 1945. What Churchill didn't realize, that was because of his own reform in bringing in long-range, fast-speed, turbine-powered, heavily armored Queen Elizabeth-class battleships. The British didn't need to fight to keep Belgium open anymore. The Germans occupied all of Belgium through all of World War I and all of World War II. And who won World War I and World War II? Was it Germany? No. It was Britain, wasn't it? And her allies. In other words, Britain did not need to go to war to survive in 1914. And the British naval leader, who was the top he also served as the top naval professional advisor to the government of Britain, was Winston Churchill. And he was one of a cabal of 4 liberal ministers, including David Lloyd George. It did not even include the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Henry Asquith was not one of the people who took the crucial decision to go to war. He simply accepted the decision once his top 4 ministers had made it for him. And Churchill was one of those 4 ministers. And he made the same mistake that Moltke made. Moltke was an asshole. He bungles the attack on the Marne. He has a nervous breakdown. In 1915, you see why this doesn't get into any of the regular histories? Where is Marx's self-respect and economic dignity in the realities of history? When the head of the German army goes mad and is convinced he is living in the 9th century and that he and the Kaiser and all the other top German generals are reincarnations of figures from German legend who conquered Italy in the 8th and 9th century during the Dark Ages. Moltke really believes this in 1914-15, and he dies raving mad a year or 2 later, screaming, "We have lifted the seal off the infernal pit. The force of eternal darkness and monstrosity is going to rise from this pit and consume Germany and the world." And it's no coincidence, therefore, that his own son later becomes a leader of the resistance against Hitler and is hanged for it a generation later. But isn't this extraordinary? You see how not just the genuinely spiritual, but the twisted spiritual, and in Churchill's case, the assertive arrogance of incompetence, Churchill makes screw up. I mean, I've given you already through Matt, you can look back to, if any of you are interested in this, I've given at Rising Tide another lecture on Churchill's military incompetence in both world wars. And for those of you interested, I recommend you scroll back and take a look at that one. But in 1914, the crucial decision to go to war, for war and peace, in Britain and in Germany, in both countries, on either side, falls into the hands of criminally incompetent individuals who are revered as geniuses. Churchill in Britain and the younger Moltke, the great nephew of the great general of 1870 in Germany. And this again, as the great, truly great, I think, British historian Paul Johnson rightly says, this is the opposite of Marxist and Keynesian economic determinism, or of Darwinism for that matter. In each of these cases, as Matt said before, you have enormous decisions that affect the fate of the entire world, the fate of the human race, the future direction of humanity. And they are made either by individuals of extraordinary quality and courage and capability, like Lincoln and Grant, or they may be made by people who everybody reveres, but who are idiots. In Churchill's case, the most terrifying thing about him is there's a terrible movie about Churchill and D-Day, starring Brian Cox, which was made a few years ago, in which Churchill acts in a very ugly personal way, played by Cox, loses all his confidence. And Churchill was simply not like that. And there's another much better movie with the great Gary Oldman doing a wonderful Churchill called Darkest Hour. And the movie, Darkest Hour, is a wonderful movie and totally factual and accurate, except for one scene. I don't know if some of you may have seen the movie. There's a scene where Churchill is overwhelmed by all the forces against him, and he gets on a subway train, a tube train in London, and all the ordinary wit and wisdom of ordinary working class English people, including, it was a politically incorrect, kindly African English gentleman. And there were literally no African-American people in Britain in 1940. The Great Immigration started under the Labour government in 1947-48. So by the 1950s, there were hundreds of thousands of African-American people in Britain, especially working in the health service and keeping it afloat for minimum pay. But the point is, this is a fictional scene, but the most absurd part of the scene is this. Churchill, at both his best in 1940 and his worst in 1914 and in 1944, was incapable of thinking he was wrong about anything. This is the awesome and ultimately also most terrifying thing about Churchill. Attlee was right. Clement Attlee, his deputy prime minister in the 1940s, calls Churchill half genius, half bloody fool. And you have to realize that people can be both at the same time. And Churchill was. As Emerson says, we all contain multitudes. We are capable of contradictory behavior at our best and our worst, and at other times. It shouldn't be so difficult to grasp. But real idiots are usually consistent idiots, just as geniuses like Lincoln and many others, or let's say in his own way, Steve Jobs, or the Beatles when Lennon and McCartney are at their songwriting height, or Mozart. You have, or Beethoven, when you have really true creative geniuses, they just keep, hitting it out of the ballpark. I apologize for the American term. Well, of course you have baseball in Canada too, don't you? I don't think you play cricket that much up there, or touch of both. But, when you have a real genius, it's like watching Patrick Mahomes in the playoff game on Sunday. They know when to rise to the occasion, and they do it every time. But in the same way, dangerous idiots like Churchill or Moltke don't just screw up once, they keep screwing up. And of course, dark geniuses like Lord Salisbury and Kropotkin create murder machines, assassination internationals for the ages. What is curious about popular culture in the 19th century, I never thought of bringing this in, but it really does belong here before we close, is that there is an intuitive popular sense in England from the 1870s to the 1930s that more is going on than we imagine. From Sherlock Holmes's Moriarty to there's a 1960s movie called The Assassination Bureau, a terribly badly made movie with a very interesting and eclectic cast. Telly Savalas, who we remember as Kojak, a lovable New York Greek in real life, as he was playing Kojak, puts on, and because he's a great actor, he's actually very good at it, he puts on, he doesn't look like an English gentleman at all, but he puts on an impeccable upper class English accent. And the other star of the movie is Diana Rigg, who starred in the Avengers of the 1960s. I think still the classiest, TV comedy action show of all time. And if any of you have never seen an episode, most of them, look up a black and white episode of the Avengers right after this on YouTube. Run, do not walk. You have a cultural revelation ahead of you. It is just a witty joy, right? But the point is, during this whole period of virtually a century, there is an obsession with the idea that in Queen Victoria's England, and at that time, there are some nefarious forces going around assassinating people and trying to cause global disorder. And these are Agatha Christie, who didn't believe in any of this stuff, even writes one of her Poirot novels making fun of it, calling it, I think, the sign of the four, the secret of the four. Obviously, a takeoff the sign of the four, which is one of the first classic Sherlock Holmes novels by Arthur Conan Doyle. And she's making fun of this convention. But John Buchan has it, and you see it in James Bond too, Inspector, this evil international mastermind, and they're usually German, they're always German or Russian. And the gallant head of the English Secret Service are fighting for goodness. And of course, it's an inversion of the truth. Because in fact, the evil Russian force does exist to assassinate the world, but it's not run by the Russian government, it's run by the British government. Everything is the opposite of what it appears to be. And because this is so far outside the imagination of ordinary people, they are incapable of believing it, even if the evidence is put in their face. This is the ultimate, most sophisticated form of brainwashing, long before the CIA, professionalized, mass psychology, and before in the 1950s, and before Madison Avenue, hired Freud's nephew or son-in-law or whatever to do it in the 1920s. The British are already doing this in the 1880s. Everything is the opposite of what it appears to be.
Absolutely. That's great. I think we have time for those two more questions if we can keep them relatively short. Stephen, now's your time.
Okay. Loved it, Marty. You make me want to turn to a life of crime, show up with an unmarked white van, kidnap you, and waterboard you with Guinness and whiskey, just so I can get even more stories. I had planned to ask
Before you go on, this is a deal, and if we are both spurred along enough, I will take you up on that. The waterboard we can do without, but the Guinness and whiskey, definitely.
Okay. I had planned to ask you if you'd seen parallels between the assassination in Russia vis-a-vis Oswald and JFK and the other ones. Of course, you answered that towards the end of the lecture. So I'll switch gears, and it kind of tangentially delves on the 1881 thing. Did you find any hint of an occult dimension to the intelligence? Because I have read some suggestion that buried within the intelligence world writ large, and it could trace back to John Dee as Queen Elizabeth's court occultist and intelligence officer. As stupid as it sounds, 1881 might have an occult significance, and even though we might all think it's Chris, in a Sun Tzu sort of way in understanding your enemy, it doesn't matter what we think. If deep state actors are of that nature, that might explain it. I'm just wondering if you got any sense of that in your research.
I have not looked at it closely enough. We're talking about very long periods of time, but there are very suggestive things that pop up in different periods of time. The whole business about Dee and Shakespeare and Marlowe, which I've given 2 separate presentations on, is an enormous subject in itself that we've only begun to scratch the surface of. Another aspect, and again, I raise this not to do myself, but for other people to do here, is the relationship between Giordano Bruno and Christopher Marlowe, who became Shakespeare, because there had to have been one. Because Marlowe is openly a member of the British Secret Service for decades, but so is John Dee. No, sorry, not John Dee. Of course he is, but so is Giordano Bruno. It is the British Secret Service under Sir Francis Walsingham who protects him from the Inquisition, and he is only arrested back in Italy after Walsingham dies, and his protection is destroyed. And of course, it is only after Walsingham dies in 1590, apparently naturally. But there is no question that there are secret and occult circles in which Marlowe, who becomes Shakespeare, are deeply involved. Just look at the play Dr. Faustus by Marlowe. And then look at The Tempest, which is a much more mellow, mature version of the classic Renaissance magician at the end of his life and career, which is really Marlowe's self-portrait. In my lectures on Marlowe and Shakespeare, I repeatedly bring out, first of all, if you look simply at the one portrait we have of Marlowe, which has only been known since 1953, but it is without question Marlowe, it is the same man, not as the Chandos face of Shakespeare, which is not well done. And remember, paintings are not automatically reliable in reflecting people. They are subjective. But if you look at the image of Shakespeare, the most famous face in the world for 400 years, the face on the face of the first folio, and why does it come out in 1623, and why does it not come out in 1616? Because the author has only recently died. And again, I recommend to you, and here it is, the late extraordinarily Roberta Ballantyne's book, Marlowe Up Close. Now, is that the face of the young Shakespeare, or is it not? How can anybody, once the idea has been given to you? It's Shakespeare as a young man, and yet it's Marlowe. And yet hundreds of millions, billions of people around the world are so conditioned from childhood, they cannot see the obvious. And this is the man who is steeped in Christianity, but he is also steeped in mysticism and magic, and in the Secret Service, as was Bruno. So I don't have a full answer for you. But in 1881, we do know this. The Okhrana has circles, and so certainly the Ogpudos, the Soviet secret police, has very dark circles indeed. And in the 20th century, the role of Satanism in both the British Secret Service and British society, and most of all in the Soviet Union, is very well documented. You have two key figures, Aleister Crowley, the famous Satanist, who actually is also a British patriot and fights Hitler and the Nazis in World War II and contributes to Britain. We don't know whether he's a clown or profoundly significant, probably both simultaneously. And after the war, Crowley is deeply involved with individuals who helped create NASA, including the founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who killed himself in what was either an occult ceremony or an advanced fuel experiment in the basement of his own house, which goes wrong in the early 1950s.
Yeah, Jack Parsons.
Exactly, Parsons, who of course also leads us directly to the Scientologists, because he has a close relationship with the later science fiction writer who becomes the founder of the Scientologists.
Hubbard.
But you also have in the Soviet Union, you have the New York Times correspondent there, who my wife particularly knows from her Ukrainian background, because he covers up the Holodomor and wins a Pulitzer Prize for doing it. And H.L. Mencken, who hates Franklin Roosevelt. H.L. Mencken hates Franklin Roosevelt and President Harding, but who does he revere? He reveres Hitler, and he reveres Lenin, and he reveres Stalin. And he reveres the reporting from Moscow of Walter Duranty. And Duranty is known to be a Satanist. And as a favor to him, because he has done the Soviet state such favors, the Soviet state gives him girlfriends to use as slaves who are in chains. He's given the ample access of the Lubyanka prison. And you can read the novels which are based on heavy documentation by Alan First, if you RST. There is one of them in which one of his and this has been documented by people who defected from the OGPU, the Stalin, the secret police, and lived to tell the tale afterwards. They did do satanic ceremonies under Lenin. Eventually, and under Stalin, to prove your dedication to rooting out religion, you had to spit on the cross and defecate on the cross and pee on the cross and do the most disgusting things to every traditional. You know, that this is what the Inquisition claimed the Templars had done 1,000 years before. But we've actually discovered what appear to be the genuine records from the 14th century of the trial of the Templars. And they were all innocent people. They were bewildered by this. They were all victims of out of control paranoia, just as Jewish victims of the blood ritual almost always were too. What's usually a question which people don't ask is, who were the inquisitors? What did they do behind the scenes? Because, again, it's Freud's understanding of projection. That
projection, yeah. Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing.
Exactly, Stephen. I mean, if you look at the Nazis, what did the Nazis accuse the Jewish population of Europe doing? Being a dark, evil conspiracy to exterminate millions of people and enslave hundreds of millions of more and conquer the world and carry out every kind of dark crime and atrocity imaginable. Who does that describe to you?
No,
it describes the Nazis.
It's obvious, and I'm sure Quan will understand this. I hate to, because we're getting late to drag it on, but you also mentioned that the world is almost opposite to what it appears. But
yes,
here you get into the concept of narcissistic mirroring. I could almost draw in Christopher Lasch and the culture of narcissism and all that sort of thinking. And I may get into that if I get into my lecture in a couple of months' time.
I very much want you to, because you led me into Lasch, and Lasch is brilliant, but I need you to make him more accessible to me because he's so intellectually demanding. And I find he's wonderful, but you have to go through him very slowly. Whether I have to go through him very slowly, I can only digest him very, very slowly.
I'm the same way.
You know, we have a similar pattern. Who are the most homophobic people who hate gay people the most? People who ought to be gay themselves, but who repress that side of their personality. And I see the contrast. When I was growing up, it was assumed. I remember I grew up in a not even a 19th century antebellum American society. I grew up in Northern Ireland when it was a Cromwellian 17th century society. And the stereotype of gay people was not just contemptible and plain wrong. You know, one is ashamed to have been exposed to it and not to have screamed abuse at it even when one didn't know better. But again, who are the people who are the most homophobic? The people who would be much better off and happier if they were tolerant of their own basic natures. Dr. Freud was right, which is why he is hated so much. You know, I regard Einstein, as you know, as enormously overrated, and Darwin with utter withering contempt. But my argument on Freud is, if you don't think he's a great man, just look at all the people who hate him from both the right and the left. You know, you have to have some virtue in you to make those kinds of enemies. You know, you have to be doing a lot right to make those kinds of enemies.
Yeah. So I don't want to monopolize it because it's getting late, but thank you very much.
Again, no, bless you.
Thanks, Marty. I loved your lecture.
Again, thank you. Look, you'll be answering more of these questions than I will, I think. And you already have.
Well, we are running towards the end here. John, I know, was waiting for quite a while. John, do you still have your question that you wanted to toss out there?
Well, I don't know. Should I go into your anti-Stalinism or should I leave that for another day? I guess it's late, so I'll leave it for another day. But I will say one thing. Britain didn't win the Second World War. Britain lost the Second World War.
No, I agree. I know what you're saying, and you're right, of course, but they were on the winning side. They managed that.
Churchill was offered the Order of the Garter in 1945, and he turned it down because he had lost the empire.
No, he took the Order of the Garter, but he did not go to sit in the Lords, and there was a different reason.
No. He received the Order of the Garter in 1953 after the assassination of Stalin.
If Stalin, which could have been the case, though, again, it's likely that Stalin was actually killed. If he was killed by Beria, I think.
It was, I don't know if Beria killed him or if Beria covered up the killing. But Beria was definitely involved in it. But he was killed by arsenic poisoning. And
you may well be right, but if you're a heavy drinking guy at 73 who has never had any adequate health cover because people are terrified, doctors are terrified dealing, and you have also just exterminated most of the best doctors in Russia or sent them to labor camps.
That's not.
You can't be surprised if the same person didn't drop dead at 73.
That's actually not true. But the autopsy done by a man who died conveniently the next day and whose house was completely destroyed. A copy was found during the declassification of the archives that took place during the 1990s. So there's no question. Sorry, it wasn't arsenic, it was cyanide. He was killed by cyanide. Anyway, that's for another day. We can discuss that another day. The Garfield was his Secretary of State supported Peru in the War of the Pacific. So and the British supported Chile, and so effectively Garfield was supporting Iberian American independence from Britain, and that was just inexcusable from the part of the British. So there's no question whatsoever that Garfield was killed by the same networks that killed ultimately McKinley and Alexander.
That is something I do not disagree with you on, but I simply do not know enough about. If I may, please do send anything you have written or anything you recommend on that, and I take the liberty of suggesting you give a lecture on it.
Yeah, I put a link by a PDF in 1994 written by Anton Chaikin. It's just a 4-page thing.
Oh, please, absolutely.
Great Britain's known role in U.S. assassinations. I meant to say something, but I'm really not feeling well right now. Unfortunately, I've forgotten what I was. So
look after yourself, man. I'm not joking.
You're gonna have more access to Marty next week anyway, so you have plenty of time to recollect the lost thought or lost question. Marty,
thanks very much, Marty.
John, thank you, and again, thank you for your contribution on the dialogue, because I always learn from you.
So we have really gone through quite the voyage together with you, Marty. You've taken us through quite a journey of opened up all sorts of new routes to explore in this forest. And I really think that there's a lot of fruitful questions that you posed. And I'm hoping that sooner than later, we can actually see a book manifest featuring your hypotheses regarding this very dense period of world history that I don't think has ever been treated the way you have just opened it up.
If I may add, again, I think much of this book has already been written, some of it by me, much of it by you and Anton and Cynthia. John has just added major contributions too. I think that Stephen is a natural, Jerry too. I mean, basically, I think much of this book has already been written by most of us in separate parts, but we just haven't put it together.
Yeah, it's a story that's waiting to be told. But we're going to be able to get at least a big chunk more of that story next week. So I hope everybody can spread the word and join back again next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Keep in mind as well, on Sunday, we have our usual 2 p.m. presentation, this one with on Rabelais and the world and geopolitical circumstances that Rabelais was intervening upon in France during the 30 Years' War, which is going to be quite interesting, from Pascal. And we'll send out the invitation in the next 48 hours or so to that. So thank you, Marty.
Thank you. It's always fun.
I remembered what I wanted to talk about.
No, John. I've got a meeting. We got a conference call. I gotta let you. I'll ask next week.
Next week.
Yeah.
Oh, please, definitely. To be continued, guys. How about that?
All right. Bye.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you so much.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks, Marty.
Bye.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, Rihanna.